Hey guys, tonight we are climbing a narrow stair to a roof of dark tiles where the lamplight is small, the air is cool, and the sky feels close enough to tap with a brush handle. You can smell sesame smoke from a late kitchen, hear one kettle mutter like a sleepy cricket, and feel the tooth of handmade paper under your palm. We're about to keep watch with Korea's old court astronomers and learn how they named quiet stars the unshowy companions that steer calendars, harvests, and bedtime without asking for applause. Reality check. If you or I tried to keep the kingdom's time tonight, you probably won't survive this schedule, ink stains, cold tiles, and a supervisor with eyebrows sharper than any sword, but it's gentle work if you love patience. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what your local time is. I love seeing this constellation of night owls. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step onto the roof of the Gwansangam, the Bureau of Astronomy. A lamp minder hands you a shielded oil lamp, its patched paper chimney pale as frost. The little flame makes an orange island on your sleeve. Beyond it, eaves and sky soften to velvet. You are the newest apprentice namer, not here to invent glory, but to practice attention until attention becomes a craft. You breathe in for 7, out for 8, and the roof stops feeling like a test and starts feeling like a porch. Below, the palace exhales. A final cart squeaks, a guard coughs like polite thunder, and the pawns quit pretending to be mirrors. Above, the northern sky holds steady. Polaris Bookseong sits like a nail pressed into lacquer. The Big Dipper, Bukdu, floats nearby with the calm of a royal procession. Mainstream fact: in early and high Joseon, astronomy is state business. The Bureau maintains instruments and calendars so the king's time keeps step with the heavens, which means farmers, ceremonies, and drums all keep step with one another. A senior astronomer clears his throat with the delicacy of a temple bell. "Say what you see," he murmurs, "not what you hope." Your tray holds a bamboo ledger, a wolf hair brush, a measuring string, and a bronze pointer shaped like a willow leaf. Quirky tidbit from the lamp minder. "Sprinkle a few grains of white rice along the parapet," he says, "and you'll know if a sly breeze is teasing your flame." You raise a skeptical eyebrow, folk physics auditing the wind, but you also pocket the grains. You don't get promoted for scorched paper. You learn the etiquette of names, which is the opposite of flattery. A star earns a description, not a trumpet blast. River star, gate star, granary star, labels that behave like tidy notes in a household ledger. Historians still argue whether Joseon naming practice draws more from earlier Goguryeo lore or from Ming-era transmissions through books and teachers, or whether both streams braid so tightly in practice that pulling them apart is just a modern pastime. Either way, a modest name invites you into a modest sky. Down the stairwell, a bell clinks from the Jagyokru, the palace water clock. Another mainstream anchor. Those clocks, intricate with siphons and float pegs, keep official time through the night so guards change, drums sound, and kitchens light fires on cue. Up here, you align your sight through a wooden frame, loosen your jaw, and wait for your eyes to gather more starlight than your impatience allows. Light joke number 1. If the stars could file workplace complaints, half would request softer glances and fewer dramatic sighs from apprentices. Try the 4th of the Dipper's bowl, the senior says. Then the faint companion north of it. You draft a first line. North of the Dipper's 4th, a modest companion, pale as steamed barley. Your brush trembles at the last stroke, leaving a tiny comet of ink you decide is endearingly mortal. He nods a holiday without snacks, and you dot the margin with a neat point, a habit borrowed from a predecessor whose hand looked like cattails in winter. From the courtyard, a guard yawns so widely you can nearly hear the hinge of his jaw. Another fact rises like cold air. The Cheonsang Yeolcha Bunyajido, the Stone Star map, records constellations and the 28 lunar lodges in carved permanence. Historians still argue whether its template leaned mostly on late Goryeo material or reached further back toward Three Kingdoms references. A cloud drifts across the moon, The lamp minder trims the wick. The night keeps its manners. Your rice grains do not move. Either the air is still or the grains are too sticky, which leads to light joke number 2. Perhaps the universe is politely waiting for a snack before proceeding. You widen your attention, find the dip of Ursa Minor, and note a modest trio low toward the northern roofs that fishermen call the ferry. You whisper the name to fix it in memory and write a calm line. Low by the northern eaves, 3 ferrymen, faint yet faithful. Legitimacy here runs on the same wire as astronomy. Eclipses predicted correctly, solstices marked neatly, almanacs announced on time. These assure that fields, taxes, and rituals meet in the middle. In your ledger, you test courtyard sweepers for 2 faint lights near the inner roofline. The senior shakes his head, smiling with one corner of his mouth. Gate lanterns, he suggests, practical, directional, humble. A fellow apprentice, sleeves too long and pride too short, ties a loop of soft silk around his wrist. He swears the faint pressure steadies the hand. Historians still argue whether such folk hedges were tolerated or simply ignored so long as the ledgers stayed tidy. Midway through the watch, your legs learn the roof's grammar. A skim of haze softens Ursa Minor. Perhaps it's air. Perhaps your eyes ask for tea. Light joke number 3. If you must record the blur, you'll name it apprentice error first of its name, then never cite it again. You close the hour with gate lanterns, ferry, and a barley pail companion. You add a quiet cross-reference to the water clock, and the dippers handle breadcrumbs for a sleepy colleague at dawn, and breathe the 7 in, 8 out that makes distance feel nearer. The senior's shadow shifts. Good, he says, which is practically poetry here. The roof smells faintly of pitch and night dew. Your sleeves rustle like small sails. You stare into the ordinary north and feel a kind of hospitality there, the way a star, once named gently, becomes easier to greet. Another line waits in the brush. The hour turns. You are not colder. You are simply here, keeping the first watch. You ease the hooded lamp into your other hand and slide along the corridor to the room that smells of pine beams and old rain, where the stone map waits like a quiet pond. The Cheonsang Yeolcha Bunyajido, chart of the constellations and the field divisions, leans under its canopy, a dark slab the palace treats like a senior relative, visited softly, cleaned carefully, never asked to hurry. You set the lamp so the flame grazes the carving, not too near, and the grooves answer with a thin pewter shine that settles your breathing. The stone is cool under your fingertips. When you lift your hand, the chill lingers, as if the sky itself has pressed a calm palm against your skin. You let your hands learn the alphabet carved here. A stipple for a star, a shallow channel for a path, a brushstroke of characters for a lodge. The outer ring carries tiny marks that whisper of the year. You can almost hear the old arithmetic that averages to a restful 365 1/4, the same slow tempo the water clock mumbles downstairs. Mainstream historical fact. This stele is an early Joseon project, commissioned so the heavens could be fixed in official memory, 28 lunar lodges, the 3 great enclosures, and a host of asterisms so calendars, festivals, and proclamations move in step with the night. The senior astronomer stands a respectful breath behind your shoulder. Let the lamp skim, not glare, he says, and you tilt the paper chimney until the lines bloom. Boundary lines the bunya run like irrigation channels for starlight, neat partitions for a dome that resists fences. You pace the 28 lodges with the soft heel of your palm rather than your feet. Horn, neck, root, room, tail. Basket names that sound like weathered poetry and market signage at once. Historians still argue whether the layout you touch was freshly adjusted to the latitude of the new capital or copied near verbatim from older Chinese charts, with only modest local corrections. You lower your head and watch how the carving gathers the lamp's glow. The dots are not uniform. Some are round, some gently seed, shaped, each a small chisel's memory. A line thickens where an old master wanted the eye to linger. A cross-stroke signals a threshold between lodges. You slide your finger along a boundary and feel how the groove turns tender at corners, as if the tool paused to listen. The stone does not insist, it invites. You trace and the sky obliges, by holding still long enough to be understood. Quirky tidbit from the lamp minder, who follows you like a shadow's echo. A dab of rice, water, and a whisper of charcoal dust will coax faint grooves to show themselves without harm. The steward has absolutely forbidden sesame oil. We are not making salad, he wrote in a memo with impeccable brushwork. So you keep to rice, water, a breath, and patience. You try the trick. A barely visible stroke swells from ash gray to readable and reveals the tiny character that labels a lodge boundary. You feel mildly ridiculous and quietly triumphant, like someone who has persuaded a cat to accept exactly one polite pat. Now the 3 great enclosures unfurl under your fingers. The purple forbidden enclosure lies like a walled city around the pole. The Supreme Palace enclosure feels like a formal garden, measured paths, measured expectations. The Heavenly Market enclosure is busiest, full of imagined stalls and offices. Here a file of dots stands not for vegetables but for officials, and one slender line promises a road. The stone remembers relationships as much as positions. One dot a whisper to the left of another, a path thickening where business ought to be brisk. In the quiet, you can almost hear hushed bargaining and the rustle of sleeves. Light joke number 1 arrives uninvited and perfectly polite. If the stone had an HR office, complaint number 1 would be, apprentices breathing on me, followed closely by, apprentices insisting they are gentle. You bow to the slab, nothing theatrical, just enough to calm the steward who lives in your conscience and lift the lamp a hair so the glow skates along the channels like dawn on a canal. The senior places a slim booklet beside the map, the office's current standard for names and spellings. We standardize so the king's calendar doesn't wobble, he says, but we remember the nicknames. You love the nicknames River Star, Ferry Star, Granary Star, the same humble vocabulary you reached for upstairs when you wrote Gate Lanterns. The grid helps you anchor them. If a cluster belongs inside this lodge at this season, your gentle name should not contradict the carved truth. Historians still argue whether Joseon astronomers measured fresh star positions for particular asterisms or mostly curated a careful inheritance, adjusting phrasing and boundaries rather than coordinates. You tilt the lamp and ease downward to a panel where a modest inscription thanks the craftsman. You run a fingertip along the pecked dots and feel how each has a slightly different mouth, some round, some almond narrow little signatures of individual chisels. Quirky tidbit. A retired clerk swore he could identify which artisan cut, which cluster by the angle of blows, and once proposed a contest to prove it. The steward disapproved, probably because the clerk was right. You picture the carvers hunched with mallets, tapping the sky into stone while someone outside boiled millet and talked about the price of salt. The flame scoops a soft triangle across the slab. You take out your taut measuring string and test a distance you know by heart, from the dipper's bowl to the boundary ring. It hums between your fingers with the smallest tension, as if the line wants to sing but remembers the hour. Light joke number 2. If only other distances, promotion, confidence, bedtime could be checked with a string and 2 pins. You coil the thread again, and the world feels tidier by an unmeasurable notch. On a narrow side panel, tiny characters explain the field divisions with bureaucratic sweetness. You recite them under your breath as if preparing a bedtime recipe. Divide the heavens thus, name the lodges thus, compute the passages thus. Mainstream historical fact. The lodges are practical lanes for the moon and the wandering planets. Guest stars are reported by which lodge they visit. And wording matters because language ripples outward to policy. You try a sentence that would look tidy in a report. A modest light, barley, pale, proceeds from room toward heart. Movement steady. A guard's step moves along the corridor like a polite drumbeat. You remember the rice grains you used on the roof and sprinkle a few at the base of the canopy to watch for drafts that might tease your flame. They do not budge. Light joke number 3. Perhaps even the breeze has taken a seat to read. You copy one small panel into your ledger, training your brush to impersonate shallow dots without drilling the paper. Courts keep redundant memories, stone, paper, and people because fire, damp, or politics will eventually ask difficult favors of the archives. You linger at the market again and think about names that behave like street signs. Asterisms are tiny neighborhoods. Riverbank, granary, drum tower. You whisper a few to test their weight in your mouth. The stone does not judge. It only offers a place where memory can sit down and be counted. Historians still argue whether the carvers understood the lore they etched or treated the pattern as a decorative commission, but your fingers report a patient intelligence at work the way tricky corners are softened so eyes can keep walking without tripping. You pause where you began, near the ring that mutters the year. Was this made for regular handling or primarily for reverent display? Historians still argue whether apprentices learned by touch upon this surface nightly or studied careful rubbings while the original stood aloof. Tonight, at least, you are allowed to learn by touch. The slab corrects your posture without speaking. It slows your looking, rounds your impatience, and tunes your voice to the tone you will need when you later write to the king. Calm, precise, never bragging about the sky as if it were your invention. You lift the lamp, check that no soot kisses the canopy, and write one last line before you leave. From stone, the sky learns how to wait. The corridor air tastes clear when you step out. The paper doors breathe as if someone is finally relaxing their shoulders, and the palace water clock drops another float to mark a notch of night. You climb toward the roof again, carrying the slab's patience in your sleeves, a weight lighter than a brush, heavier than a promise, and you feel how those boundary lines in stone have already begun to tidy the constellations in your own mind. The stair to the clock pavilion curves like a gentle comma, and you follow it with your lamp cupped in both hands, rice grains still tucked in your sleeve from the rooftop trick. The room opens around you with the hush of a library. Water answers first. Not a splash or a brag, just the patient syllables of a drip meeting a brass cup, then another and another, until the rhythm settles under your skin like a second heartbeat. If time had a favorite sound, it would be this. Small, repeatable, unfancy. You bow toward the Jagyeokru, the self-striking water clock, and to the keeper who guards it with the calm of a cat warming a lap. The keeper shows you the chain of custody from drop to drum. A small head tank weeps into a feed pipe. A bronze spoon the size of your palm catches each measured tear. When the spoon tips, a float nudges a lever. When the lever climbs, a wood pin steps a gear. When that gear completes its quiet pilgrimage, a little figure raises a mallet and taps a bell so soft you feel it more than hear it. Mainstream historical fact. During King Sejong's reign, court artisans under Jang Young Sil built such self-striking clocks so knights in the palace would keep regular company bells, drums, and puppet attendants marking hours whether clouds listened or not. You kneel with the measuring string and the dipstick. The water level should kiss the mark etched like a thin smile inside the tank. It does not. The smile sulks half a finger below. The keeper hands you a bamboo sliver, and you tickle a tiny plug in the spout. One drop becomes a fraction bolder. You count to 100 with your breath. 4 slow cycles of 5. In, 5, out, 2 of 7, in, 8, out. The roof practice now repurposed as a metronome. The spoon tips on schedule, the doll nods on schedule, the bell answers on schedule. If it ever claps too loudly, the keeper says, it's bragging. We adjust until it purrs. Light joke number 1. Somewhere, a very proud drum is filing a complaint that it has been demoted to purr. You take out your ledger. You write with the same decorum you used beside the stone map. Feed steady, spoon respectful, bell polite. The water smells faintly mineral, like damp stone and old winter. Quirky tidbit from the keeper. On bitter nights, he warms the feed water in a clay jug near the brazier before pouring, to keep viscosity from sulking and time from sticking. Rice paste seals the joints, he adds. Lacquer keeps them honest, and superstition keeps my hands from rushing. He taps the tank with a knuckle and whispers, steady. You resist the urge to thank an appliance. Now, the sphere, the senior astronomer says, appearing like a quiet punctuation mark in the doorway. You follow him to the brass armillary, the onui its rings stacked like a slow-turning onion of circles. The base sits on shims so thin they look like brass autumn leaves. One of them is a coin worn smooth by a century of pockets. Rings for meridian, for equator, for ecliptic, for horizon. Sighting tubes like sleeping flutes. Nodes where patience hardens into pivots. You lay a palm on the largest ring. It is cool, almost damp with the breath of the room. Your hand comes away smelling faintly of oil and old cloth. You level the base. A bubble in a wineglass vial creeps into its centered rest. Your modern eye enjoys the familiarity, but the old method sits beside it, a droplet on the rim that refuses to run. You set Polaris in the sighting tube, the ring's slow arc carrying your gaze like a fairy from the gate lanterns you named earlier to the barley. Pale companion that made your ink tremble, the dipper looks patient about being measured again. If it could file a ticket, it would request that apprentices stop poking it with willow leaf pointers after midnight. Light joke number 2 logs itself without leaning on the bell. You check the alignment by transit. The tube kisses the North Star. The lower ring settles toward the horizon. The pointer hums against a faint engraved scale no wider than the nail of your smallest finger. The senior nods, hearing an inaudible click that tells him the sphere's temper has improved. Mainstream historical fact. Armillary spheres in Joseon service presented the sky as interlocking brass arcs. With careful alignment, they let astronomers read right ascension and declination, or their local analogs in traditional coordinates, so that star names could rest on measured angles, not only on stories. Write what the brass says, the senior murmurs. You do. Pole seated, equator polite, ecliptic steady, dipper by the hand. Your brush remembers the stone map's chisel marks and the water clock's breath. Historians still argue whether Jang Young-sil's earliest self-striking clock used a primitive escapement or a float-driven stepping mechanism with weighted links. Much of the original burned, and reconstructions rely on palace diaries and later machines that may have bragged a little on their ancestors' behalf. The debate hums like the clock itself, steady, reasonable, not offended by patience. The keeper brings a tray with 2 goose quills and a coil of silk. The quills are for clearing spouts that pretend not to be clogged, he says. The silk is for polishing a sighting tube until starlight stops sulking. Quirky tidbit number 2. A veteran swears a single fish scale, lodged under one shim, cured a wobble for an entire winter. Everyone knows that cannot be true. And everyone knows which drawer holds the lucky scale. You pretend not to notice the drawer behaving as if it were ordinary. You swing the ecliptic ring until it grazes the position where the moon will wander next week along the 28 lodges you palmed on the slab. The marker stones in your head horn, neck, root, room line up with the brass-like lines in a favorite poem. The senior asks you to read a position aloud, and you do. Slowly, as if you were tasting tea. Just within room, to heart, motion measured. The phrase comforts you. It would look tidy in a report, harmless in policy, useful at a window where a farmer checks his calendar by lamplight. Hours grow flexible in the drip room. The automaton raises its mallet again, yielding a tap you feel in your shoulder blades. You test the spoon's swing and find it a whisper heavy. You shave a breath off the inflow, an almost imaginary adjustment, and the rhythm accepts you back. Light joke number 3. If only self-control came with a bamboo plug and a goose quill. A page arrives to borrow a time mark for a ceremony rehearsal. You give him the next 2 bells, and the one after dawn. He bows, thanks the clock by habit, and vanishes like punctuation at the end of a satisfied sentence. The sphere waits for you to return. You do. And you practice a tiny rotation, nothing dramatic, just enough to feel the brass say, "There, that's smoother." In the language of tolerances, you imagine Jang Young-sil's crew filing here, polishing there, checking a pinion with the same quiet pride the stone carvers left in their dots. Historians still argue whether the Hancheonui you touch descended cleanly from Goryeo prototypes or was essentially reinvented under Sejong with new math and tighter craft. The argument has the tone of 2 old librarians speaking softly between shelves. Your ledger grows a pleasant spine of repetitions. Bell soft. Drip loyal. Tube polite. You sketch a thumbnail of the spoon's travel. A small arc with a dot at the comfortable end. You note the temperature with a fingertip against the tank. Cool arms suggest a slower night. And add a line about warming water if frost threatens. The keeper brings a tray with 2 goose quills and a coil of silk. The quills are for clearing spouts that pretend not to be clogged, he says. The silk is for polishing a sighting tube until starlight stops sulking. Quirky tidbit number 2. A veteran swears a single fish scale, lodged under one shim, cured a wobble for an entire winter. Everyone knows that cannot be true. And everyone knows which drawer holds the lucky scale. You add one last callback to the map. Market Star Lane matches scale at this hour. Because the stone's patience and the brass's precision are cousins who enjoy visiting one another, you close the ledger with the same care you would fold a festival sash. On your way out, you set 3 grains of rice on the threshold. They do not move. The lamp's chimney gives your cheek a small, civilized warmth. Behind you, the drip resumes its monologue about patience, and the brass goes back to pretending it is motionless. You are already listening for the sky on the roof, but you carry with you 2 new ways to hear it: the steady breath of water and the softness of a ring that turns by persuasion rather than force. Upstairs, when you point to a faint companion and write a humble name, it will be time itself that steadies your hand. You return to the roof, carrying the brass smell of the armillery on your sleeve, and the patient syllables of the water clock still ticking in your ribs. The night seems a shade clearer for having been discussed indoors. You set the hooded lamp down behind a tile ridge so the flame won't tempt moths into bad decisions, and you lean into the wooden siding frame that the older apprentices call the window. It is nothing mystical, 2 vertical slats and a crossbar, but you treat it like a throne room door because of who sits behind it. Buckseong, the North Star, steady as a nail tapped into lacquer. You breathe the way the clock taught you regular, unflustered, and nudge the sighting notch, until the pale point of Polaris rests where the frame expects it. It does not hurry. It never does. Mainstream historical fact. In East Asian court astronomy, Polaris is the celestial emperor, the center about which the heavens make their slow bows. Alignments for palaces, processions, and calendars take their tone from that quiet authority. On this roof, the metaphor isn't abstract. When your tube is seated on the pole, your ledger, your heartbeat, and the palace drum down there all agree to stop fussing. You set your willow leaf pointer on the frame and find the dipper like a servant moving through the chamber with dignified chores. 4 stars hold the bowl. 3 step out as a handle. The 7th, at the hook's tip, winks as if it approves your punctuality. You whisper the nicknames as you trace. 1st guard, 2nd guard, 3rd guard. Simple rolls around a sovereign presence. The Big Dipper is a clock face so old it forgot to brag, and tonight it keeps its composure while you check your notes. Quirky tidbit you learned from a grandmotherly clerk. Some home altars once offered a polite spoonful of rice to Cheonsang the 7 stars on a child's birthday, asking for long life and a calm path. Offerings to stars wear the same hush as offerings to elders. And yes, your pocketed rice grains feel slightly more ceremonial now. The stars do not frown at domestic manners. They only continue. You take a long, slow reading. The dipper's bowl tilts. Its handle points. In spring, it lifts in the east like a ladle preparing to scoop. In summer, it hangs high to the south as if rinsing. In autumn, it pours toward the west. In winter, it rests low to the north, handle tucked. It's an old rule of thumb in these latitudes, old enough to live in proverbs. Light joke number 1. You will be disappointed to learn there is no actual celestial soup, only the pleasant flavor of being on time. Still, the kitchen image helps an apprentice remember what the brass has already taught. You mark the orientation with a tidy phrase, handle south, bowl level, hour agreed, and the senior, somewhere behind you with eyebrows at half-mast, grunts approval. The water clock's doll taps a bell below, perfectly polite. You count the space between the tap and your breath, and feel how the empire's timetable braids itself. A drop, a mallet, a star, a note in your ledger, and far beyond the palace, a farmer who rolls over at that same bell and decides he has exactly one more dream before dawn. The pole is not a mathematical point to your eyes. It is a small patch of sky that behaves graciously. Historians still argue whether Joseon astronomers relied entirely on imported tables for the pole's offset or recalculated with local latitude and careful nightly transit, and whether corrections for Polaris's small distance from true north were routinely applied or simply absorbed by craft habits. You do not get drawn into the quarrel tonight. You do what your hands can. You set the tube, you listen to the brass say, there, and you scribble a quiet correction that lives in the margin like a shy advisor. You sweep the dipper again because the dipper encourages repetition the way a lullaby does. The senior has you recite the orientation rhyme, and you add a line of your own, a mnemonic that will never appear in any royal preface. If bowl pours west, fetch cloak. If handle points south, send tea. Light joke number 2. Congratulations. You've invented the world's least rebellious poetry. Your teenage self would be mortified. Your sleepy adult self is grateful. A thin haze moves and moves away, as if the sky pulled a gauze sleeve over its wrist. You test a trick you did not admit aloud in the clockroom. You blink slowly to spread tears across your tired eyes, then look slightly off-center so the faint points pop. Physiology and patience share a bunk bed on this roof. You reward the barley-pale companion you found on your first watch with another mention. You write, companion north of 4th bowl star still barley. Pale, uncomplaining. If you ever meet a star that complains, you will immediately promote it to poetry and retire from bureaucracy. The dipper's orientation offers more than charm. It gives the court a way to keep nights organized in weather that rudely ignores parchment. Messengers time their departures by it. Exam proctors grumble less because they trust it, and the drum corps carries itself like officials with clear instructions. Mainstream historical fact to anchor your feeling. Court almanacs, supported by observations like these, announced the solstices, equinoxes, and the schedules of state rites. When announcements were right, the king's virtue looked orderly and the granaries looked full. It may be romance to connect a ladle of stars to rice in a bowl, but by morning the metaphor feeds people. You check the frame against the temple roofline, carved dragons pretending indifference to your alignment, and you see how builders obeyed what you obey now. The whole palace is a conversation with the pole. Gates mirror gates. Axes assert themselves. Courtyards hold a pause like a good sentence, and everything quietly points to where the sky holds still. If you ever forget where to stand, the buildings remind you by standing correctly first. Light joke number 3. On a bad day, even the tiles have better posture than you. The senior prompts you for the dipper's guards, and you find them without haste, tracing how they circle the pole in eternal duty. You think of the stelae, where the heavenly market and purple forbidden enclosure nested around this stillness. You think of the brass rings that made circles into instruments. You think of the water that made a circle of hours out of a trickle. You draw one neat compass, rose in the margin north petals slightly fat, because love is never perfectly symmetrical, and you feel your sleeplessness obediently shrinking. There is one more matter to record, one you only have to glance at but must never forget. Precession, the slow, royal drift of the axis. The pole star is an emperor by appointment, not by birthright forever. Long before your watch, other stars perform the duty. Long after, another will. Historians still argue whether court tables in late 15th century soul-baked tiny pole shifts into calculations for ritual timings, or whether the accumulated error was so modest it remained a footnote until later. Corrections. You mark pole offset negligible for tonight's duty, which is a clerk's way of saying, we will not panic about centuries while the moon is behaving. A breeze rouses the lamp's paper chimney and tests the rice grains you left like tiny counselors along the parapet. 2 roll half a bead and stop, as if bowing. You shade the flame with your palm, then angle the frame to keep the sighting notch from catching glare. The motion becomes a sermon with no scolding in it. Protect the quiet thing, and the quiet thing will return the favor. You feel a tug toward nicknames again. Gate lanterns. Fairy. And you promise the dipper you will not shame it with anything too cute. The sovereign deserves accurate titles and kindly metaphors, not gimmicks. You take one last alignment, more for your own peace than for the report. The handle points just shy of south. The bowl steadies. The pole acts like the grown-up in the room. Down below, the water clock's dial taps a gentle agreement that becomes an order for a guard change. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a canal sleeper rolls and dreams of threshing. Somewhere inland, a pair of oxen snore like old shoes. You dot the ledger. Sovereign stars anchor timetable, roof compliant, apprentice less fussy. You gather the pointer and your lamp. You bow not to worship, not even to conclude, just to say that names matter because they help you stand still in a world that prefers drift. Buxeong continues, as ever. Bouc du circulats as ever. You warm your fingers at the chimney, thank the rice for its diplomacy, and follow the line of roof tiles back toward the stair, where the palace breathes a slow, synchronized breath and the night smiles at the unremarkable miracle of everyone keeping time together. You set the ledger where the lamp's halo won't bully your night vision and let the roof steady. Tonight you walk without moving, a slow circuit of the 28 lunar lodges, the sky's quiet streets that the moon visits one by one. You murmur their order to steady your hand. Mainstream historical fact. The lodges divide the ecliptic into regular segments. The moon spends roughly a night in each, giving officials and farmers a built-in calendar you can verify with naked eyes. The stone's grooves become lanes in your gaze. Begin with the eastern set. Horn points to here, a signpost for seedbeds and first stirrings. Neck and root are names that sound like work. Room grants domestic permission to air bedding and arguments. You promise to air grudges, too, on the low setting. Heart reddens within Scorpius like a coal. Its midnight pride warns that heat will ask for respect. Tail suggests swept thresholds, and basket gathers the week's odds and ends. You note horn, seedbeds, neck, tools checked, root, transplanting, room, linens, heart, heat and thunder, tail, sweeping, basket, bundles. Historians still argue whether Joseon handbooks ever codified chores by lodge, or whether such pairings lived mostly in proverbs and in the good sense of households that trusted what the night kept repeating. Either way, a modest name domesticates enormity. A lane turns an abyss into a hallway with a light left on. North, the tortoise in inherited diagrams waits with steady furniture. The dipper keeps time like a veteran drummer with ox and girl strolling nearby. Ox is honest as a work animal. Girl arrives with a smile you don't over-explain. Emptiness, rooftop. Wall architecture for cool air repairs. Retie a gate rope. Check roof seams. Joseon almanacs married these nightly lanes with the 24 solar terms so festivals, irrigation, and taxes could share one heartbeat. You think of a farmer who reads a single line, moon in dipper, and decides to do exactly one more task before sleep, the same way you steal one more line for your ledger. You copy from the stone slab, heavenly market within the northern enclosures, and picture tiny stalls. You pair that with ox and girl, market day and a shelf counted twice. Quirky tidbit from a retired scribe. His grandmother used the ox lodge as a bedtime excuse. No arguing. The ox is watching the gate, which is astronomy or parenting. Historians still argue whether Joseon glosses followed Ming manuals or drifted locally. Your ear likes the local softness, but your brush copies standards without sighing. West brings legs, bond, stomach, hairy head, your fond name for the Pleiades. Net, beak, 3. Hairy head rising means cold mornings and steam breath. It is tool mending season file, patch, pretend last year's break. 3 stands where Orion strides and lends people borrowed backbone for chores that cannot wait. You note legs, travel permits, bond, rafters and rope, stomach, feed bins, hairy head, needle, net, beak, tackle. 3. Courage in a coat. If the lamp minder asks why courage is a packing list item, you will say it fits anywhere. You toss one eye toward your barley pail companion from earlier watches and give it a nod for being punctual without boasting. South brings well, ghost, willow, star, extended net, wings, chariot. Well is obvious. Buckets feel heavier when it rules the evening. Willow brings river paths and the soft switch of branches against sleeves. Wings and chariot sound splendid. You grant them practical dignity, canal checks, wheel grease, oar pegs. Star and ghost sit oddly to modern ears, but your ledger treats them kindly. Star for clear sky notices, ghost for ancestor rites, and the gentler superstitions that keep neighborhoods polite. You can almost hear the court's voice behind yours, reminding you that naming never happens far from policy. A calm phrase here saves someone from an anxious decree later. You watch the moon actually doing the thing your mouth rehearses. In reports, language stays plain. Moon enters room. Moon departs heart. Your mind keeps pairing names with household rhythm. When the moon visits, well, you check bucket ropes. When it crosses willow, you allow a riverside walk. When it rests by star, you let the courtyard boys tune their flutes. Quirky tidbit. Sailors swear by a rhyme that groups lodges into friendly clumps for steering. And if the moon doesn't cooperate, they blame the cook. This solves nothing but restores morale. You lean on the wooden frame and read the sky like streets. The dipper keeps its baritone. The water clock keeps its drip. You sketch headings for tomorrow's board horn time chores, well-timed checks, willow time walks, so gatekeepers remember the river still exists. Historians still argue whether late Joseon reports kept omen language or trimmed it to please serenity-loving kings. You suspect the truth is seasonal. When harvests are steady, prose is simple. When locusts wander, adjectives multiply. Because you like tidy things, you try a mnemonic packing a one-year suitcase with one token per lodge: horn, compass, neck, spare cord, root, seedlings, room, bedding, heart, brazier, tail, broom, basket, twine, dipper, ladle, ox, harness, girl, ledger, emptiness, empty box, philosophical, rooftop, tiles, wall, mortar, legs, boots, bond, rope, stomach, rice jar, hairy head, needle, net, tackle, beak, hook, 3, lantern, well, bucket, ghost, incense, willow, fan, star, notice board, extended net, weights, wings, oar pins, chariot, axle grease. If an audit asks, you will deny ever packing the sky. The moon climbs from the eaves, a thin bowl tonight, and slips toward the next lodge like a punctual guest with a wrapped pastry. You write the official phrase that folds into the almanac. Moon traverses neck toward root. Sky's obedient. The senior will like obedient. It is bureau code for we may breathe. You tuck one rice grain into the ledger's crease, for luck, a habit you pretend not to have started, and feel the lodges turn from exotic nouns into directions. Somewhere in the city, a millstone resumes its purr. Somewhere on a ridge path, a watchman decides this hour belongs to listening rather than speaking. Historians still argue whether the court recalculated lodge boundaries for Seoul's latitude or relied on imported tables with practical corrections from experienced eyes. Either way, your wooden frame and steady breath place you safely inside tonight's lanes. You underline sky's obedient because you know the moon will ignore it tomorrow in her elegant fashion. That is her right and your occupation. You rinse the brush, warm your fingers at the chimney, and listen for the softest sound the night admitting it is satisfied for now. Below, the clock's dial nods and taps. You close the ledger gently and keep one eye on the moon's path before dawn. A sky of lanes, a year of errands, and you ink-fingered rice-haunted walking every street without leaving the parapet. You return to the desk the way a river returns to its banks without fuss, taking the curve you already know. The lamp's paper chimney wears a tiny brown kiss where the wick burned too confidently earlier, so you pinch it shorter and give the flame a whispering job. The ledger opens with the sound of a folded sleeve, and the senior leans on the parapet, not to supervise, he says, but to keep the stars from bragging. Tonight your lesson is naming etiquette, which turns out to be less like inventing poetry and more like labeling drawers in a well-run kitchen. Rule 1. Describe, do not declare. A name should point, not pose. Gate lanterns. You wrote on your first watch, and the senior liked it because it told a colleague where to look and what to expect. Too faint? Patient lights near the inner roofline without pretending to improve the sky. Rule 2. Be humble. Nothing gets called Emperor's Jewel unless it is actually seated in the purple forbidden enclosure and has a dossier 200 characters long. Rule 3. Be useful. If a farmer, sailor, or messenger cannot use the phrase at midnight with a sleepy brain. It is not a name. It is decoration. Mainstream historical fact gives backbone to the rules. Joseon court astronomy follows the inherited system of asterisms, 3 great enclosures and the 28 lodges, so that every designation plugs into an existing lattice. Names behave like citizens. They register in households, enclosures, on streets, lodges, and by occupations, granary, star, ferry, star, drum tower. Your brush lives inside that order. The stone map downstairs mutters, "Remember your lanes," and the armillary in the clockroom agrees with a brass cough. Rule 4. Keep your adjectives calm. Color words are allowed only when the eye insists. Barley, pale companion. You wrote. Earning a half nod, but adjectives that pamper your ego go into the basket of retired names. Yes, there is a literal basket, a reed one with a crack where drafts die of embarrassment. Quirky tidbit the lamp minder swears is true. If you sneak a boastful name into the basket, the rice grains you've been hoarding will refuse to roll for wind tests until you apologize. You did not believe this until 3 stubborn grains staged a sit-in by the parapet. Rule 5. Cross-check. A gentle name must not contradict the brass or the stone. You propose a phrase with the citing frame, test it on the armillary's scale, and then make sure the Cheonsang Yeolcha Bunyajido's boundary lines won't scold you. If the market is inside this enclosure at this season, your Market Lane nickname cannot point west of a wall carved 5 reigns ago. Calm names live where calm lines permit them. The senior has you practice categories. Relational, companion north of the 4th bowl star. Occupational, fairy stars along the eaves. Seasonal, frost, herald near Harryhead. Directional, gateward light beneath the wall. You draft, cross, reference, and read them aloud. Hearing matters. A name that looks tidy can trip the tongue at dawn. You test 1. Courtyard broom, east of girl. Your own mouth protests. The senior says, too domestic near that lodge. And you try again. Rake star by girl's sleeve, which passes because it sounds like something a sleepy guard can repeat without chewing it. Humor floats in, small and permitted. You propose supervisor's eyebrow for a prickly pear near the dipper. The senior's eyebrows rise in self-defense. You withdraw it with a bow and offer watch prongs, which earns an amused exhale. Joke 1 survives. In this bureau, the stars are allowed personalities, but the officials pretend not to have any. Rule 6. Avoid omen. Bait unless the sky provokes it. Words like guest, broom, banner, and blazing have histories that make ministers lean forward. Use them only for true comets, true visiting stars, true sweeping tails, true scorchers. When nothing dramatic occurs, let names purr about work lanterns, ferries, granaries, wells. Historians still argue whether Joseon editors in serenity-loving reigns softened traditional omen vocabulary more than their Ming contemporaries, or simply filed it under quieter headings. Your ledger practices the soft verbs on principle. Now the senior unlocks a shallow drawer with a quiet flourish and sets out 2 exemplars, the kind of names, apprentices, copy, until the wrist learns humility. Market. North Milestone. He reads. Faint. Helpful. It's a signpost name. Safe and generous. Outer Ferry Return. He reads next. Paired lights. Unobtrusive. Paired lights. You look up and find them again. The ones you greeted on the first roof hour. You write. Outer Ferry Return confirmed. Barley. Pale companion still patient. Joke 2 tiptoes in. You feel you should send the companion a small thank you gift for being so compliant. Perhaps a new adjective every solstice. There is, tucked behind the official rules, a delicious informal layer the Bureau admits only at 3 in the morning. Poetic nicknames that never enter proclamations but sneak into margins and mouths. Cricket stove, someone once wrote for a tiny trio near the kitchen quarter of the enclosure. A kindness to night attendants. Sash tie, for a kink of stars that helps align a street when fog insists on guessing. These nicknames travel by whisper rather than seal. Historians still argue whether such vernacular names were widespread within the bureau or mostly confined to households and guilds. A few faint pencil traces in surviving ledgers make the case either way, and then smudge out. Rule 7. No flattery by title. Stars do not get promoted to duke because you like them. Conversely, no insult by title. Stubborn Speck once appeared beside a misbehaving point and was scrubbed by sunrise with a sigh in hot water. A name should behave like a good servant, present, precise, and invisible when the room needs quiet. Your pen tries Northgate Knocker for a faint dap that helps with orientation near wall. The senior scratches a small character for Lil beside it, sow in the margin. A taming charm, and suddenly the phrase behaves. Quirky tidbit from a former steward. He kept a secret list of little additions, and claimed the list itself protected the palace from arrogance. Rule 8. Sleep on it when possible. A name that pleases at midnight may turn silly by second bell. The Waterclock's doll is, improbably, your co-editor. You mark provisional beside 2 phrases and promise to consult the drip again in an hour. Joke 3 waves from the doorway. If the automaton refuses approval, you will petition for a different puppet with kinder literary taste. The procedure for approval feels ceremonial and domestic at once. Before dawn, the steward collects candidates for the morning board. He dislikes flourish and loves commas. You prepare each phrase with its coordinates, its lodge context, and the plainest possible description. Barley, pale companion north of Dipper Bowl's fourth. You write, then add a parenthesis for colleagues. Often useful when haze softens smaller frame notches. You tuck a rice grain in the ledger crease again. You will never admit this in an audit. A practical concern sneaks in. Language. Official names live in classical Chinese characters. Notes sometimes wander into Hangul when you want to catch a pronunciation or save time. Historians still argue whether Hangul appeared frequently in bureau margins after its invention, or whether most working copies remained all character out of habit and hierarchy. Your page tonight holds both. Bones in characters, whispers in Hangul, which feels like sandals under a formal robe, quietly comfortable. You test a final candidate for the night. 2 faint points that bracket the temple roofline. You try roof brackets. 2 carpentry. Class. You try eave pins. Better, and it speaks to the builders who laid the axes by the pole. You consult the brass angles, agree. You consult the stone boundary permits. You consult your breath, 7 in, 8 out, and the flame. Everything approves. You write eave pins and stack a tiny pleasure behind the letters, not because the name is brilliant, but because it is accurate, kind, and will help a tired guard point without guessing. The senior closes the drawer with the exemplars and says the most generous sentence in his repertoire. That will do. You bow as if the phrase were a bestowed sash. Somewhere below, the doll taps, the spoon tips, and a clerk clears his throat to awaken the morning board's commas. The dipper tips, the pole sits, and the moon moves between lodges with its usual refusal to consult you. You sand the ink, let the grains of powder settle like snow over the strokes, and close the ledger on the soft sound of work completed. Naming, it turns out, is not an act of conquest. It is the opposite. You learn to shrink, to fit your syllables to dots already glowing, to place modest words where they will help someone else see. You leave the desk lighter than you arrived, as if humility were a tool you can actually feel in your hands, polished by many nights and, like the brass ring and the carved stone and the water's steady mouth, made reliable by use. You settle at the low desk, where the wood remembers wrists and the paper remembers weather. The lamp's chimney throws a small meadow of light across your tools. Inkstone, inkstick, brush roll, straight edge, paperweights shaped like a carp and a sleepy tiger. You have called stars by humble names. Now you must make those names behave on the page, which begins with the most ordinary magic, water, soot, and circles made with patience. You pour a thimble of water into the shallow well of the inkstone and set the ink stick to its rough bed. Circles, not back and forth, your teacher's voice is steady as the clock below. The first turns sound like silk being folded, then like a kettle trying not to boil. Pine soot loosens into the pool with a clean, cold smell. and your hand softens its grip until the stick floats under your fingers. Mainstream historical fact. Joseon officials wrote with Miox solid ink sticks of soot and glue ground on a stone and carried in sleeves like portable night. When the mix thickens to the gloss of a crow's wing, you try a test stroke on scrap Hanji mulberry paper made to endure fingernails, winters, and bureaucracy. The fiber drinks the ink without bleeding, as if it understands your vows about neatness. A clerk glides past and sets a bundle by your elbow, tonight's ledger sheets pre-ruled in a grid the steward calls the fence. You were told they were bamboo paper when you arrived, and you believed it until the papermaker laughed kindly and explained the backing slats were bamboo, the paper itself, Hanji. You like the compromise. Bamboo bones, mulberry skin. Historians still argue whether particular divisions and ruling patterns at the Bureau were standardized under Sejong or drifted by department. Surviving ledgers tease both stories by keeping the lines and changing the margins. You unroll the bundle and anchor two corners with the carp and tiger. The carp makes the better secretary. The tiger pretends not to care but keeps the page still. You lay out your straight edge and a narrow bamboo strip scored with small notches, a memory helper for the 5 nightly watches and their 3 subdivisions. The water clock's polite doll will nod on time, but your page wants a place where time can sit down. You write the first line with the modest ceremony that keeps typos frightened. Rain year, lunar month, sexagenary day, the night's watch. Your hand remembers to breathe. In the next column, you copy the phrase you've now written enough times to let it sing by itself. Moon in neck proceeding to root. Skies obedient. Formula becomes lullaby here. Each observation has its sentence shell. Locus, motion, brightness, temperament, weather. Companion north of the 4th bowl star, barley. Pale, uncomplaining. The words are not impatient to be admired. They only want to be recognized by a colleague at dawn. Quirky tidbit you inherited from an archivist with ink on both cuffs. He kept a grain of roasted barley in his brush case and chewed it when writing barley, pale, claiming the taste improved his adjectives. You tried it once. It improved your appreciation for warm tea. Ink behaves like a creature with pride. Too thin, it pouts into gray. Too thick, it clots into arrogance. You add 1 drop of water with a hairpin. Stir. Test. The brush tip, wolf hair with a rabbit's soft belly, drinks and sharpens to a point you could sign a snowflake with. You roll the belly gently against the stone to set the taper, then lift and feel the ink's weight decide your first stroke. Light joke number 1. If only personal resolve could be adjusted with 1 drop and a hairpin. Across the top margin, you draw a tiny grid that no one trained you to draw but everyone uses. A bead for clear, a cloud curl for haze, 3 short slashes for wind that refuses to mind its manners. You mark a single curl. The lamp minder in the doorway nods he has been blaming the same curl all night. Keep your rice grains handy, he whispers, still loyal to the rooftop trick. You tip 2 into the ink lid as if they were small consultants waiting for a vote. Now the ledger's tone takes over. You write as if you were speaking to someone sleepy but precise. No flourishes. If a phrase can be shorter without becoming stingy, you shave it. When you must decide between faint and barley pale, you check the stone below your fingers for leftover honesty and pick the one that the page will respect in winter. Historians still argue whether nightly observation logs were copied clean each morning into bound registers or whether the working sheets themselves were sealed. A few smoky water stains suggest both practices, depending on stewards and weather. You add a cross-reference to the Hanui brass. Angles by tube confirm eve pins within wall. This is how the furniture of your nights stays bolted together: stone, brass, roof, ink. The carp paperweight stares at you with its permanent surprise. You grin back and draw a discreet dot after confirm, the Bureau's tiny code for checked twice, breathe. Light joke number 2. If only the Bureau would let you stamp breathe in cinnabar, you'd do it on your forehead. When the bell below gives a soft tap, you shift to the line that marries heaven to habit, a brief note for the morning board. It isn't poetry. It's a shopping list for policy. No anomalies in northern enclosures, market lane visible, moon steady, forecasting ceremonies unchanged. These are the sentences that keep gates opening on time. taxes collected without surprise, and festival drums struck with confidence. Mainstream historical fact. The Bureau's observations fed the state almanac and ritual schedule. Accuracy wasn't vanity, but the spine of granaries and diplomacy. A misreported eclipse could panic a court. A clean night like this lets the kitchen count rice calmly. You write the first line with the modest ceremony that keeps typos frightened. Rain year, lunar month, sexagenary day, the night's watch. Your hand remembers to breathe. In the next column, you copy the phrase you've now written enough times to let it sing by itself. Moon in neck proceeding to root. Skies obedient. Historians still argue whether Hangul's presence in technical margins spread quickly after its invention or remained a household convenience. Your page enjoys behaving like a household, where discretion and practicality sit side by side at the same bowl. The lamp hiccups, a wick ash collapsing on itself like a tiny tent. You pinch, trim, breathe. The chimney clears, the gold pool steadies. You dip again and write gate lanterns steady. Then, because humility likes company, you add apprentice less fussy, a joke you will erase before the steward sees it. Light joke number 3. Future historians will argue whether the phrase appears in any archive. It will not, because you are not that brave. Ink has small customs. You dry the brush point against the rim of the stone while turning it slowly, the way you would twist a thread to a needle. You never leave it standing in the pool. You cradle it in the brush, rest a little glazed hill, known to crack under hot tempers. Quirky tidbit the lamp minder shares when he catches you staring at the rest, the last one shattered under a temper tantrum, so famous it is still referred to as the eclipse of the brush. He swears the steward made the culprit copy the month's almanac headers 10 times as penance. You believe this not because it must be true, but because the rest looks as if it knows. Lines accumulate. The grid fills. A neat column of small circles marks the watches first, second, third, like soft footsteps toward dawn. Your handwriting evens out as if the page has convinced you that you have always been tidy. Eve pins confirm north alignment. Companion barley, pale. Wind unsure. Moon to root, river calm. You allow yourself one domestic noun for every 3 celestial ones, so the city does not float away from the page. You leave slim spaces for the steward's commas. He loves them the way the clock loves the spoon, precise, unboastful, a mechanical mercy. You tuck a tiny note into the margin for yourself. Check rake, star by girl's sleeve, wording after tea. Names improve when tea has spoken. Historians still argue whether tea or porridge made better editorial decisions in winter. The Bureau archives remain diplomatically silent on the subject, though spilled porridge is easier to identify than spilled tea. When your hand loosens enough to match your breathing, you realize the ledger has taught you a new posture, chin a little lower, shoulder blades unknotted, jaw believing it belongs here. You smooth the last line with powdered sand that falls like patient snow, lift the sheet by its corners, and slip it into the drying frame where bamboo slats and cotton threads hold the night safe from elbows. You close the inkstone with a fingertip, like closing a gentle mouth after a lullaby. Outside, the roof waits with its small catalog of nicknames, gate lanterns, ferry, Eve pins, ready to be called again if the clouds allow one more look. Below, the clock doll nods at the spoon and taps a promise that dawn will arrive on schedule. You rest the brush in its roll and feel your own schedule unclench. The world's largest instrument, the sky has permitted you to label 3 or 4 of its strings for another night. You will never own a song this big, but you can keep time, keep ink, keep sentences friendly to sleep. And when you blow the lamp lower and the page glows like a single warm tile in a cold roof, you believe that formula, far from killing wonder, is how wonder learns to stay. A page appears at the roof hatch with the careful urgency of someone carrying soup, no sloshing, no drama, just a scent of, please look now. You follow his finger to the east, where the sky shows you an extra grain of salt sprinkled where you didn't leave it. Not twinkle steadier, not a planet wrong place, wrong schedule. You ease into the wooden sighting frame and let your breathing catch up to your eyes. There it is. A newcomer settling among familiar dots like a quiet guest who forgot to knock. You do not say the word aloud yet. You mark the lodge first, net, by your reckoning, and then the distance to its nearest neighbor with the willow leaf pointer, the way you'd measure space on the stone map in the dark, with only patience for light. Your brush, for once, doesn't try to be poetic. A guest star, you write Gaexiong. Small, steady, barley, pale. Mainstream historical fact, court astronomers across East Asia recorded guest stars, novae, and supernovae in official annals by lodge and separation, just as Josian scribes logged the bright visitor of 1572 and later the 1604 star. Both entered with positions and tempered words, so the palace could respond without panic. Tonight you are one of those scribes. Except you also have a rice grain superstition in your sleeve and a lamp minder who will claim credit if serenity holds. You check movement, none perceptible against its neighbors in this first breath of observation. You lean away, blink tears into cooperation, and look again slightly off-center so that faintness reveals itself. Still there, still pretending not to be news. The page breathes in time with you 5 slow counts in, 7 out. Say it. The senior murmurs from the shadow near the chimney. You say it, but like someone delivering tea to a room where someone is asleep. Guest star within net. He nods. The phrase itself is an omen, but a restrained one, folded into the lattice of lodges you've walked all week. Because you are obedient to practice, you write it 3 ways. In the ledger for the night, in the margin of the morning board draft, and on a slip for the armillary room, where brass likes to be included. You add the tempering phrase all your mentors love, no disorder in the winds. Light joke number 1 arrives with a napkin. If only adding that line could also calm the steward's eyebrows. The water clock's dull taps, polite as a butler who never over-explains. You go downstairs to the honui, because names need measurements when the king reads before breakfast. The brass is cool. The shims behave. Polaris sits like a host who knows exactly where you should stand. You sight, sweep, and read the angle. You whisper it twice, so your tongue can remember it for the page. Then you write, guest star within net, north of beak by so many parts, choosing a unit that the steward will accept and the roof will not resent. Historians still argue whether Josian observers in certain reigns favored degrees by imported habit or stuck to traditional fractions of the lodge. A handful of surviving sheets argue both sides while the brass remains neutral. When you return to the roof, the sky has added an extra courtesy, a thin stroke trailing something to the south, almost arrogant in its subtlety. You think at first your eye is inventing a hair on the lens of night, but the hair refuses to vanish, and when you shift the frame a little to let the black sky carry it better, the tail answers. A comet. Not a banner, not a broom taking over the courtyard, just a tidy switch sweeping the air. You keep your mouth calm. The steward likes serenity. The king, by temperament tonight, prefers a sky that speaks in prose. You will give them both. Quirky tidbit from a colleague who swears by small hacks. In a shared drawer sits a spool of thread, dusted with ash so lightly it looks like winter on silk. For thin tails, he says, stretch the thread across the frame to catch the angle. The ash will make the line visible if the lamp sits properly behind your shoulder. You try it, expecting to feel ridiculous, and instead feel scientific. The thread shows the tails lean like a plumb line for air. You record its direction and the span it seems to brag, no more. Wording now becomes your real instrument. Broom star is the formal term. Thin tail is the nurse's phrasing that calms a child. You draft. A broom star seen faint, tail narrow, motion toward room. Brightness modest. You avoid omens that belong to other reigns and other tempers. You do not write scour, banner, or sweeps the throne, the phrases that make ministers whisper and rice merchants hoard. You include breeze and cloud symbols from your tiny weather grid, because a thin tail can be a liar in wind. You rehearse the report to yourself as if you were an audience who wanted a nap, not a spectacle. Locus. Net for the guest, toward room for the comet. Motion. None in the first. A polite creep for the second. Brightness. Barley for the first. Bean skin for the second. You will replace bean skin before dawn. Temperament. Untroubled. Thin. He will like untroubled, the senior says, and you pencil it where the steward's commas won't rearrange it into a sermon. Light joke number 2 leans its elbows on the parapet. You promise the sky a festival if it will keep surprises at Beanskin for a week. The sky, being the sky, offers no opinion. Down in the clock room, a breath warmer than before, the keeper sets a clay jug near the brazier to nudge viscosity. You take that as the universe's version of a scent. You slip a paragraph into the morning board that remembers state nerves without poking them. Guest star with innet, small and steady. Broom star with thin tail proceeding. Winds obedient. Ritual calendars unchanged. Mainstream historical fact, again to steady your pen. Such notes entered the Sung Jong-won diaries and the annals, where phrasing could shape policy, for instance, whether to announce additional rights, adjust travel plans, or simply ask the weather office to watch cloud lines more closely. When the wording was calm and the nights repeated themselves, a kingdom rested better. Historians still argue whether certain annals entries that read guest star in late 16th century, Hoson described a true nova or a slow-moving comet observed poorly in weather. You add in your head, but do not. Right. Because the steward has never once thanked a footnote. You content yourself with accuracy and the promise to watch again before the second bell. The lampminder arrives, fascinated, and offers his own folk physics. Set a shallow bowl of water by the parapet, he whispers. A thin tail will show its tilt in the reflection. You do it, mostly to humor him, and the bowl surprises you by catching a faint diagonal your eye kept smoothing away in the air. You mark the angle again. Quirky tidbit then enters the ledger with the discretion of a good roomer. Angle confirmed by water bowl. Wind indifferent. You're careful with degree of worry, because words change temperature when they travel. Guest star is news. Thin tail is housekeeping. You leave out metaphors that court chroniclers used in hungrier times. You keep in the facts. Lodge, neighbor, angle, drift, because the king does not need poetry at breakfast. He needs the assurance that the sky is being watched by people who can tell the difference between awe and panic. Light joke number 3. You consider adding, apprentice refrains from panic, but decide to give your future biographer fewer opportunities. The ennui gives you a second reading without argument. The stone downstairs will hold its dignity if you bring the rubbing block for a quick check of lodge boundaries, so you do, and the tiny characters that map net and room answer you with their usual grainy patience. You copy one line exactly as carved, no creative improvements, and feel the comfort of letting stone take responsibility for reality. When you return to the roof for a last look before the bell, the guest star remains politely unremarkable, and the thin tail keeps its etiquette. You allow yourself the smallest whisper of allowance in the notebook, destined to be sealed. Watch tonight again. If tail thickens, adopt broom phrase. It is a sentence that remembers omens without feeding them. You draw one rice grain across the parapet and watch it not move. The lamp makes its small wind of warmth. The city makes its larger wind of sleep. You close the ledger page with the same phrasing you used when nothing happened, because continuity is also a reassurance. Same columns, same ink density, same little dot that means checked twice, breathe. The steward will, you hope, run a finger under untroubled. The king will, you hope, nod once and sip. The doll will tap. The roof will receive another set of cautious eyes. And you ink-stained, ash thread using, bowl of water setting you will go on naming quietly, even when the sky forgets its manners and brings guests without warning. Because careful words are part of the instrument set, and serenity, like a measurement, is something you can choose to maintain. Fog clocks in the way a lazy cat occupies a warm cushion without asking, completely justified. You feel it first as the lamp's small halo shrinks, then as the dipper's fourth bowl star grows shy, then as your eyelashes collect the light like tiny wet brushes. You back the hooded lamp farther behind the tile ridge so glare doesn't crowd your pupils, and you slide 2 fingers into a pinhole circle, a trick the senior taught you to sharpen the faintest points. Your breath remembers the water clock. Steady in, longer out. You are not fighting the sky. You are improving your manners around it. You set out the night's weather kit. The paper fan that lives for smoke emergencies, A folded oiled paper screen to keep dew from the ledger. A spare wick trimmed to a neat spearhead. The willow leaf pointer polished by habit. And yes, the ridiculous but useful saucer of water that helped you judge a comet's tail. The lamp minder appears, already scolding the wick with his eyes. Proud again, he mutters, and pinches it shorter. The smoke thins to silk. Light joke number 1. If the Bureau ever writes a manual on humility, the wick should get a co-author credit. Clouds come in personalities. There is the gauze that makes you a better observer by forcing patience. There is the wet felt that sits heavy as winter laundry and tells you to polish brass instead. And there is the monsoon sheet that rolls from the south like a new wall being moved into your room. Mainstream historical fact. The Joseon court took weather seriously enough to invent and standardize the Chugugi rain gauges under King Seong's orders in the 15th century so rainfall could be measured, logged, and argued about with numbers rather than hunches. On nights like this, you thank the gauges and also the steward who lets you note haze like breath on glass without being accused of poetry. Smoke is its own weather. Perilla oil behaves differently from tallow, and a wick that flares will ash into its own tiny comet, which is charming in the kitchen and intolerable beside the siding frame. You fold a narrow chimney of mulberry paper 2 wraps, not 3, slide it over the lamp, and set the flame low enough to be embarrassed. The chimney's edge glows like the thinnest gold ring, and your pupils relax as if the room has remembered how to whisper. You dust the ledger margin with a pinch of sand so the ink dries before dew can turn it into tea. The senior taps the frame. Glance off center, he says. Not because you forgot, but because repetition is a kindness when the sky pretends to be milk. You do. And the barley pale companion north of the bowl's 4th shyly returns, as if it were standing behind a curtain the whole time. You mark it with your calm phrase and feel your shoulders unclench. Your eve pins near wall? Still cooperative. Gate lanterns? One blinks behind a scrap of fog, then brightens as the breeze changes its mind. Light joke number 2. Somewhere, a moth files a complaint that you've moved the lamp and spoiled its reading light. Eyes are instruments with a schedule. You rest them on purpose. You warm your palms, cup them gently over your sockets, no pressure, just darkness, and count a slow 20. When you lift your hands, faint stars seem to have been polished. Quirky tidbit from a sailor who once traded cloud stories for tea. Hold a tiny droplet on your thumbnail and sight a faint star across it. If it sparkles, your eye is dry. If it sits, you need a blink practical optics hiding in tavern advice. You add to the ledger's weather grid a small dot you invented for eyes refreshed, which the steward will never notice and your future self will be absurdly grateful for at the second bell. Fog thickens. You test the rice grains along the parapet, still your favorite tiny consultants. 2 roll a hair, then stop, which means the wind up here is playing fair even if the lower courtyards carry whispers of damp. You angle the frame to keep what little glow there is out of the notch and trace the outline of the dipper by patience rather than confidence. Handle south by a half hand, you write. Bowl milked, but polite. Historians still argue whether the Bureau kept continuous rooftop watches in the worst weeks of Jangma or shifted to daytime calibrations with the Onui while sending only cloud and wind notes at night, the senior says, almost cheerfully, because nothing delights a veteran like a debate that doesn't change the work. Diaries suggest both. Some summers, eyes on the roof. Other summers, hands on brass. Calm words about clouds. You take out a tiny card with 3 pinholes punched by a needle. It lives in the drawer with the ash-dusted thread. You hold it before the frame and let each hole give you a different aperture. The faintest points settle, less ruffled by your own optics. You note your barley pale companion again. With that shy pride, an apprentice is allowed when patience pays without special effects. Light joke number 3. You briefly consider naming the pinholes smaller humility, but the basket of retired names already looks full. Between fog sessions, smoke insists on its agency. You trim again. The lamp minder shows you his old trick. A whisper of salt rubbed into the wick's crown, which he swears keeps flare at bay and smoke less mischievous. You try it on a spare wick and watch the flame settle like a cat committed to staying. No official manual will admit this, but 3 watchmen and 1 steward's niece do. Eyes have their foods and their stubbornness. A clerk brings chrysanthemum tea, swearing it washes the gaze. You sip, skeptical on principle, and discover that warm cup plus pause plus steam rising into your eyelashes really does make the world more legible. Quirky tidbit number 2. The lamp minder keeps a tiny stone cooled in water. He presses it to his eyelids for a breath on bad nights. It looks ridiculous and works, which is a combination the Bureau quietly respects. A breeze combs the fog into rags. The dipper's handle returns with the complacency of an elder who knew you'd wait properly. The pole sits. The market lane within the enclosure peeks through like a street seen from a high window when rain pauses. You amend the morning board note you drafted earlier for comets and guests. Haze in patches, observations studied by frame and chimney, no change to ritual timetable, mainstream historical fact, folded here so it looks like common sense. Almanacs and state rights tolerated clouds because their schedules trusted long cycles. One milky night did not rewrite solstice drums or tax deadlines. But it did make ledgers fusher. A page brings something you're not sure whether to love. A pair of wire-rimmed lenses. Young spectacles, rare still, foreign-looking, rumored to have come by way of China and curious Jesuit hands, then copied just enough to fetch whispers at court. You try them and immediately feel as if you are reading the sky through someone's very tidy handwriting. They help some distances, hinder others. Historians still argue whether spectacles became a familiar tool among late Joseon officials or remained a literati novelty until much later, the senior says, and rescues the lenses from sliding off your nose. You return to your pinhole card with gratitude. The card does not pinch. Fog makes comedians of roofs. Tiles collect beads that roll into your collar when you least expect kindness. You laugh softly, wipe gently, and move the ledger farther under the oiled paper screen. You add one more note to the practical column. Eve, drip, notable. The steward loves that word notable because it promises the world can be tolerated by pen. Below, the doll taps, possibly to remind you that nights have ends. When the haze lifts for a stretch long enough to count heartbeats into the hundreds, you revise 2 phrases for accuracy, not drama. Companion barley, pale, becomes companion barley, pale, steady after cloud. A tiny hedge that future you will decode without thinking. Gate lantern steady becomes gate lantern steady. Lamp smoke obedient, which is your way of thanking the wick without embarrassing yourself. Your eyes feel human again, which is to say slightly vain and mostly grateful. By the time the second bell flirts with the edge of the hour, the monsoon's mood has shifted from lecture to lullaby. You streamline the morning board. Wind untroubled. Cloud in curls. Visibility adequate by frame and chimney. Guest star still present. Thin tail as before. You put the pinhole card back, with the ash thread and the lucky fish scale you all pretend not to believe in. You lean on the parapet and let your pupils widen until the roof, the city, and the sky are one dark room with polite lights placed in it. You do not defeat fog. You outlast it with good manners. You do not banish smoke. You negotiate until it learns to whisper. You do not command eyes. You rest them, feed them, and forgive their moods. And when you write, "Skies obedient tonight," you do it with a small smile, because obedience, like clarity, arrived by a series of tiny decisions. Trim the wick, lower the lamp, warm the palms, blink, wait, measure, and keep the ledger as neat as the water clock's spoon. The fog loosens into tatters, and a runner from the instrument hall bows with the politeness of someone asking a star to change chairs. You follow him off the roof and down a corridor that smells of pine smoke and oxidized brass. Inside, the workshop drowses like a big animal brazier's purring, bellows sighing, a file whispering against a tooth. The tinkerers you've heard about look up with eyes that have measured angles all day. One has a bit of gold leaf stuck to his thumb. Another wears a leather apron polished by 1,000 elbows. On a bench sits the modest celebrity of your nights. A small prototype of the self-striking water clock, its spoon cocked as if listening to gossip. A craftsman with silver in his queue taps the spoon once with a nail and nods at you. The drop is shy tonight. Warm the feed water, and it will remember courage. He doesn't say please. The instruction is the politest thing in the room. Mainstream historical fact. Under King Sejong, artisans led by Jang Yong, Sil built instruments that stitched heaven to timetable the Jagyokru, self-striking clepsydra, the Angbuilgu, stone sundial, the Chugugi, rain gauge, celestial globes and armillary spheres so the court could keep ritual, agriculture, and travel obedient to measured cycles. You touch the little clock's frame the way you'd pat a shoulder before an exam. The wood is smooth where hands have turned impatience into polish. Names, the silver Q craftsman says, behave better when instruments behave. His finger lands on a brass gear that looks like a cookie with disciplined teeth. If the bell sulks, your phrase for the dipper's hour will wobble, and the steward will think poetry happened. He shudders theatrically. Light joke number 1. You promise never to let poetry happen to the clock again. On a stand nearby, a sighting tube lies on a cushion. Its rim wrapped in silk, so breath will not freeze there and turn your eyelashes into banners. The maker lifts it, shows you how a hair's width of misalignment grows into a whole wrong adjective by the time it reaches the page. We file until your sentences exhale, he says, and you feel personally adjusted. Then the door opens and quiet moves with a person. The senior does not bother to hide his pride. Jang's shop, he says simply, a phrase that feels like a bell rung once. You have heard the stories. A man born outside the usual ladder, raised by Sejong for talent instead of pedigree, coaxing timekeepers and sky readers into a vocabulary the palace could live by. Historians still argue whether Jang Yong-sil personally drafted every tooth and lever of the Jagyo crew or directed a team whose anonymous hands deserve equal billing. They also debate how much of the Han Cheonui's final form should be chalked to him versus court astronomers like Yi Sunji. The argument lives in diaries, not in this room, where tools greet you with practical affection. They show you a chugugi, nothing grand, a bronze cylinder open to the rain with a neat scale inside. A ruler that listens, the brazier keeper says. We empty it into a graduated cup and argue with numbers, not with size. He grins. He has the satisfied air of someone who won a fight with a cloud. Quirky tidbit. In one winter, he confesses, the apprentices wrapped the chugugi with straw like a tiny thatched house to soften the shock of sleet. The steward called it unseemly, and then quietly asked for the pattern. On a table sits an angbugu, its bowl incised with hour lines, a little gnomon ready to cast shade like a civil servant moving on schedule. The maker smears the bowl with a film of water, so you can practice reading reflected light when clouds make shadows vague. Sundial by moon, he jokes, and everyone pretends that isn't nonsense. Light joke number 2. You threaten to submit moon dial readings, accuracy excellent in imagination, to the morning board. The armillary ennui stands in the corner with its rings glinting like disciplined halos. You set your palm to it and feel the workshop's breath in the brass. A junior smith slides a shim under one foot, a coin so thin it looks like a promise worn smooth, and the whole instrument relaxes a fraction, as if a violin string had been tuned from anxious to kind. There, he says, and your shoulders copy the adjustment. You begin to notice how these tools tutor your prose. The clock's drop lengthens your sentences into fairness. No panic, no rush, just a cadence the king can drink tea to. The armillary shrinks your adjectives until they fit into angles. The chugugi teaches you that adequate rain is a civic blessing, not a yawning report line. The sundial insists that shadows carry manners, and so should you. The senior catches you smiling at your own thoughts. Good, he says. Let the instruments edit you. A ledger lies open on a workbench, with columns unlike your rooftop sheet dimensions. Alloy, tolerance, a row for feels right, quietly more important than it looks. You write a cross-reference. Eve pins checked by tube after brass shim adjustment, alignment more polite. A smith laughs softly. We should engrave polite on a ring, he says, so it can scold the others. On a table sits an angboilgu, its bowl incised with hour lines, a little gnomon ready to cast shade like a civil servant moving on schedule. The maker smears the bowl with a film of water so you can practice reading reflected light when clouds make shadows vague. Sundial by moon, he jokes, and everyone pretends that isn't nonsense. Light joke number 2. You threaten to submit moon dial readings, accuracy excellent in imagination, to the morning board. The senior walks you through a wall chart cycles for 7 luminaries, the moon's manners across the lodges, the solar terms that make granaries nod. Mainstream historical fact. In Sejong's court, the Cheonsang tables, calculations of the 7 planets, were compiled and refined so positions could be predicted, corrections issued, and almanacs updated. You run your finger down a column and feel how numbers turn into drums, gates, and tax receipts. The craftsman with gold leaf on his thumb mutters, "We polish brass so your commas land in the right month." A debate punctuation mark sneaks in here too. Historians still argue whether chugugi gauges were deployed consistently across provinces or functioned mostly as capital ornaments recorded with pride and checked irregularly. The surviving bronze cylinders tell a story of both ambition and weather, which is to say, compromise. You tuck the thought into your pocket with a rice grain and a stub of pencil. Now someone brings out a wooden model of a horizon ring, cut with low hills, and a temple's roofline the way your eyes meet them on the roof. Practice, the senior says, and you lower the little sighting tube so that gate lanterns and eave pins sit where they should. The model tugs a string in your chest. It is ridiculous, and it is beautiful, a toy that keeps language honest. You adjust by a thumb's width, and the barley, pale companion, etched as a tiny pinprick of silver, falls into place. The room murmurs its approval as if you had tuned a zither. You realize that your night's quiet names were shaped down here long before you wrote them. Quirky tidbit 2 arrives wrapped in shop smell. A pot of varnish mixed with raw garlic juice sits under a cloth. Keeps insects honest, the varnisher says, and apprentices humble. You pretend to be immune to the fumes and fail. Everyone approves, no one is immune. The senior folds your night back into the day's machinery. When you put untroubled on the board, he says, it is because men and tools conspired for calm. He taps each device in turn, the clock for time, the sphere for position, the gauge for water, the dial for shade, and finally, the ledger for words. You can't name a star straight if your instruments lean, he adds. The sentence sounds like a proverb the stones would agree with. Before you slip away, you touch the little clock doll's hat and thank it for waking guard shifts without scolding. The boy beams like an apprentice, promoted to official sleep. The senior presses into your palm a brass shim thin as a whisper. For your pocket, he says. Not lucky, honest. You love it instantly for not promising charms. Back on the roof, you set the sighting frame as if the armillary were watching. The dipper obliges with a crisp handle. The pole sits. You write, angles by tube agree. Bell polite. Rain since last watch. 1 cup. And it feels like writing a chord instead of a note. The city breathes with you, shops streaming behind shutters. A kiln learning to cool itself. An ox correcting its own posture in sleep, and you feel the king's mourning already beginning in the water clock's careful mouth, the workshop's rings, and your ledger's commas, all of them small inventions carrying a very large quiet. You carry the night's measurements like folded paper charms in your sleeve and drift toward the stretch of year when the sky remembers stories out loud. The roof tiles cool your knees. The lamp's chimney hums the key you've been writing in for hours. Far above, the river of stars, the band you have labeled and triangulated and cross-checked with brass unbuttons its uniform and asks to be called by slower names. You oblige without leaving your ledger. Cheonsang arrives the way a whispered appointment does, on the 7th night of the 7th lunar month, when heat rests its elbow on the parapet and the Milky Way pretends to be a bridge. Mainstream historical fact. In Korea, Cheonsang marks the once-a-year meeting of Jikneo and Gyeonwoo, the weaver girl, and the cowherd, embodied in Vega and Altair on opposite banks of the Sky River. Households bathed in Cheonsang water, ate seasonal wheat dishes, and let the story cool the evening. You tilt the frame toward Lyra, find Vega with unargumentative ease, then step across to Altair in Aquila, a sober neighbor who keeps appointments. The ledger wants numbers. Your mouth tries a softer remark first. 2 lights across a river, punctual. You do not abandon your tools. You line vega on the tube's hairline, note the azimuth like a cook repeating a recipe, then check the dipper's orientation to confirm the hour. You hear the clock doll tap. You taste steam from someone else's noodles drifting up from a courtyard where wheat not rice is the honored guest tonight. Quirky tidbit the lampminder's aunt swore by. Dew gathered before dawn on Chilseok, rubbed on the face, makes the year more cooperative. If you laugh, you must still try it, which is how belief becomes skincare. You mark the dew symbol in your private grid, a bead that means morale. Tell it straight, the senior says, and you do. Vega bright, Altair bright, Milky Way crisp, winds obedient. Then, because names also keep kitchens company, you write a tiny note beneath for the morning board clerk who is secretly fond of stories. Chilseok observed. Households peaceful. Historians still argue whether Joseon court protocol acknowledged Chilseok beyond seasonal mentions in palace diaries, or left the romance largely to folk practice. Ledger scraps smile both ways, official timekeeping up here, bowls and baths down there, and a bridge sketched between by 2 stars you can actually measure. You step back from the frame and let the story move through you like a breeze that means no harm. On nights like this, even the stone map downstairs seems warmer. Its market lanes and palace walls pretending to be city streets where 2 late walkers meet at a bridge and stand there, saying nothing urgent. Light joke number 1. If the magpies who form the bridge ever demand payroll, the Bureau will need a new line item. Avian engineering. Modest. Past Chilseok, the year leans toward rituals that smell like kitchens and calculations at once. By winter, the shadow at noon has been training for its longest stretch, and the palace watches for it like a student hoping the bell will ring. Mainstream historical fact. Dongji, the winter solstice, was an important hinge in Joseon. With the 24 solar terms tracked in almanacs, the court confirmed the day the sun paused longest at the south and then began its slow return. At home, families ate pachuk red, bean porridge whose color, by old habit, was thought to push away mischief. You run a finger along the armillary's ecliptic ring in your memory and feel how the Onui taught you to hear the sun's grammar of tilts and pauses. At noon on that day, this roof knows noon by rumor and ledger. You imagine the Angbilgu in the courtyard below, keeping its shadow like a neatly folded sash. The line creeps toward a mark scratched by a patient artisan and interrupts at exactly the length that tells everyone, turn the page. Longest noon shadow measured. Chugugi frozen but polite. Clock's true, you will write, then tuck the brass shim in your pocket as if lighter words could warm fingers. Historians still argue whether specific Dongji ceremonies under different reigns favored austere rites at the royal altar or emphasized almanac proclamation and kitchen custom. The annals breathe both registers, ritual above, porridge below each steadying the other. You remember the first time you saw pachuk on a palace servant's tray? A red lake, the color of careful luck with pale rice ball islands, Sayalsim, birds' eggs floating where mischief might have landed. The steward's niece confessed that at home they touched a dot of porridge to the gate lintel and room corners. So the winter would behave. A practice you recorded nowhere and retained everywhere. Quirky tidbit. One clerk paints a tiny red dot in the upper margin of his Dongji ledger page every year and claims his ink freezes less often. You have not adopted the superstition, except the one year you did, and it worked, which you do not admit out loud. You look up again. The winter sky is not stark. It is generous with faint things. The dipper sits low, handle tucked like a handled blanket. Orion, your 3-lodge hero, has already lifted his shoulder over the eaves. You stroll the 28 lodges in your head and feel how the calendar and the kitchen rhyme. Well and bucket, ghost and star, net and beak and chariot, all the words you made into coordinates rehydrate into scenery when festivals knock. Quirky tidbit the lampminder's aunt swore by. Dew gathered before dawn on Chilseok, rubbed on the face. Makes the year more cooperative. If you laugh, you must still try it, which is how belief becomes skincare. You mark the dew symbol in your private grid, a bead that means morale. Your ledger becomes bilingual in its own way these weeks. One column keeps the compass talking as usual: angles, lodges, brightness, weather. The line below breathes in household prose. Chilseok quiet, Dongji confirmed, markets polite. These are not policy lines, and yet they are soft cables that keep bridges, gates, and breakfasts synchronized. Mainstream historical fact to pin the mood. The 24 solar terms, geolgi, such as Ipchun, start of spring, Ipchu, start of autumn, and Dongji, winter solstice, structured work, tax, and right. Almanacs issued under the Bureau seal arranged civic life around what the sun and moon actually did, not what someone wished they would do. Historians still argue whether Chilseok's weaver and cowherd story had direct place in Joseon astronomical teaching, or circulated mostly in vernacular song while formal texts stuck to enclosures and lodges. The senior delivers the line as if he were reading a gentle weather report. You think of your own page, where both languages coexist, the formal and the one that makes elders smile in kitchens. You decide not to resolve the question. You only resolve to keep both in view, the way you keep Vega and Altair in one thought when you look at the river. A guard on the north wall coughs a call in response with the water clock stall. The echo says the second watch is behaving. You put the frame on Vega for a last check and consider what a name does to a story. Weaver, cowherd domestic work made noble by distance and annual permission. Gate lanterns, eave pins, domestic architecture made navigational by attention. The ladder between is short, a roof, a bowl, a spoon, a bridge, a ledger. Light joke number 3. If you ever write, porridge star, the senior will resign, and the steward will promote the doll. You draft the morning board text with festival muscles warmed up but still disciplined. Chilseok clear, Vega and Altair bright, dew abundant, social peace. Dongji observed, noon shadow longest, red, bean porridge widely prepared. No omens inferred. You add one more sheet for the archives with numbers so clean they are practically lullabies, azimuths, altitudes, lengths, cloud symbols. The steward will approve both the story that reassures and the line that triangulates. On the way to hang the drawing pages, you pass the stone map room and pause long enough to rest your palm on the bunya lines. The heavenly market enclosure looks especially comfortable tonight. Perhaps it is the smell of wheat and porridge in your head, or perhaps the stone itself enjoys festivals the way stone can by holding still while people relax. You whisper, "Market, North Milestone. For an old dot you love and feel the word, do again what it was built to do. Point without drama." Back on the roof, your rice grains do not move. The chimney glows a narrow halo. You mark a final note that satisfies both the Jesuit tables you puzzle over in other sections of the year and the grandmother who prefers bridges made by birds. Night friendly, river bright, measures true. Scholars will keep their debates. Kitchens will keep their recipes. The sun will take one long breath at noon and begin returning like an apology that took all day to write. And you, ledger bearer, lamp whisperer, apprentice namer, will keep folding both languages into second person until the king's tea tastes like punctuality and the city's sleep tastes like porridge, with the red taken seriously enough to be kind. You borrow a cloak that smells like charcoal and low tide and follow a courier gate out to the river, where boats do what stars do, keep moving while pretending to stand still. The night is clean enough to taste salt on the air and ink on your tongue. You lay the little sighting frame on a pier pile as if it were a passport and greet men whose hands have learned angles without brass. They call you Bureau, with the same teasing respect you use for their word coast. You trade names like spices, your buxiong, their north nail, your gate lanterns, their quay lamps, your eve pins, their mast pegs. The ledger in your sleeve warms up to the idea that useful words wear work clothes. They show you their compass, a lacquered box with a needle that insists on being dramatic, and a sandglass that counts watches by patient falls. Then they point where you point, to the dipper's handle, to the bowl, to the barley, pale companion you've been seeing through fog and humility all week. Handle there, flood there, an old pilot says, ticking off shoals with his knuckle on a plank. Mainstream historical fact. Mariners on these coasts sail with monsoon seasons and the pole. The Big Dipper's rotation and Polaris's height are working cues, joined by compasses and sand glasses, while travel on land follows state post roads and milestones that carry the kingdom's pulse between stations. When he adds, "If the handle lifts, we're home late and honest," you recognize a proverb that could live in your ledger without smirking. You try your wooden frame against the horizon and let the pier become your roof. The river's mouth keeps the sky's manners. West is still west, north still a grown-up, and the Dipper tilts like a ladle rinsing under starlight. You draw a neat note for yourself. Harbor frame agrees with roof frame. Bowl level. Handle south. Current mutters. Light joke number 1. You consider asking the current to sign the morning board. The current refuses, busy being a sermon about patience. They talk swells the way you talk lodges. One swell comes regular from the outer sea, long-legged and polite. Another shivers from a far storm, nervous and thin. The river's own pulse lays a crosshatch under both. You squat with your lamp behind your heel and watch the swells as if they were lines on a brass ring. Follow the friendly one, a skipper says, until the north nail sits a thumb above the tiller's peg. You step back from the frame and let the story move through you like a breeze that means no harm. On nights like this, even the stone map downstairs seems warmer, its market lanes and palace walls pretending to be city streets where two late walkers meet at a bridge and stand there, saying nothing urgent. Light joke number 1. If the magpies who form the bridge ever demand payroll, the Bureau will need a new line item, avian engineering, modest. You ask about names, and the harbor hands produce theirs like pocket knives, quietly, comfortably. Gull's ladder, a 4-step asterism that helps them slide between two shoals. Net mender, a triangle tucked by the quay. Salt wife, a pair that clings low to the southern wall like someone waiting with a lamp. You answer with rake star by girl's sleeve, and Eve pins inside wall, each cross-checked against stone and brass. Historians still argue whether fishermen used formal lodge terms or kept to household nicknames transmitted by guilds. You murmur, and the pilot shrugs the way water does. Both why not, as long as boats come home. The river is a road that never dries. You think of the land roads, the post stations, yoke, with their spare horses, the milestones that report so many rye to the next pot of barley tea, the beacon mounds on the ridges, bong su day, that practice fire as punctuation. A border guard you meet a few nights later knows your sky as architecture. He sights the pole along a notch in the palisade and keeps his patrol cadence by the Dipper's tilt. "Handle down, fresh coals," he says. "Handle west, wake the snorers." He shows you how he ties a thread to a spear and reads its angle between the watchtower slit and Polaris, your ash-dusted workshop trick reincarnated in leather and wind. You gift him your pinhole card. He gifts you a rhyme that makes sense only at altitude and midnight. When 3 strides, lock the south gate twice. You sketch the rhyme into the ledger in small, obedient characters, careful to label it vernacular aid. You also copy the technical backbone right beside it. At this watch, Dipper bowl pouring west. Polaris 1 thumb above beam, wind obedient. The water clock's dial is far away now, but you still hear its tempo inside your ribs. The sand glass on the guard's bench, 2 slim bulbs. One honest waist answers in sandy counterpoint. Light joke number 2. You entertain, for 1 irresponsible minute, the fantasy of a doll marching up mountains to strike a bell for patrols. The wind vetoes the idea with a polite laugh. You walk the borderline and the coast with your second-person road kit. Frame, thread, bowl of water, rice grains. Rice does sailor duty, too. 2 grains on a thwart show, a sly cross-breeze you might have misnamed, stubborn oar. For the bowl, you set it in the stern and sight a thin star across the glossy 5 of reflection. If the V leans, so does your plan. The men watch you work through these small household spells and nod as if you were speaking their dialect at last. Names are for pointing, you say. And coming home, one adds, which is the same sentence in 2 voices. Back at the harbor, a boy with hands like knots draws in charcoal on a plank the route his uncle sailed to the islands. Head out when Harry Head, the Pleiades, clears the mast, Keep the north nail a finger above the port cleat. Turn when the three lodges' bright shoulder makes a door with the headland pine. You watch the map fattest at the turns, fear lives there, and wisdom, and you translate into your lattice so that the story can sit down in the bureau without blushing. Depart when hairy head rises 2 fingers, steer by Polaris height. Landfall when Orion's shoulder makes door with pine. You write, and then you add, broom star thin, untroubled. Because your comet is behaving and fishermen like luck told calm. You keep the debate in your mouth even while your feet are content. Historians still argue whether late Josian small craft generally preferred close coastal piloting by landmarks and smell over anything you would dignify as astronomical navigation, reserving stars for course checks and season. Some diaries praise Polaris outright. Others praise rocks with names that sound like uncles. The truth, standing on a deck that creaks like an elderly official stretching, is obviously both. You can steer by a pine and confirm by a pole without ever feeling disloyal to either. On the land road back, milestones look like cousins of your asterisms, quiet stones that say, "You're here," without applause. A courier leans his back against one, drinks, and watches you square the pole against a ridge notch the way he squares his schedule against the post station roster. If the doll taps and the bowl pours west, he says, I eat early. You want to commission a wall chart, star orientations for snack timing, and suspect the steward would approve if you called it patrol efficiency. Light joke number 3. You promise yourself to keep the joke in your head and the phrase efficiency gains on the board. Tell it straight, the senior says. And you do. Vega bright, Altair bright, Milky Way crisp, winds obedient. Then, because names also keep kitchens company, you write a tiny note beneath for the morning board clerk who is secretly fond of stories. Chilsiok observed, households peaceful. The morning board will say, sea lanes calm, border beacons polite, no change to ritual calendars, moon to room, and nobody will know that border beacons polite means a guard who ties a thread to a spear and says twice when Orion makes a door. You climb to your roof and set your frame as if every pier and ridge is still watching. The pole sits, the handle leans, the barley pail companion keeps its kindly appointment. You add one domestic line to your notes for the future apprentice, who will inherit your tricks. When the world is a road, use the same sky. Then you blow the lamp just low enough to flatter the stars, tilt the ledger toward dry, and let the river, the mountains, and the palace arrange themselves under a single, patient north nail that has never asked for a salary and takes its coffee as silence. You spend a portion of the night at a desk that smells faintly of seaweed paste and old bamboo bindings, copying numbers that traveled farther than you have. The courier who brought them in wears the tired pride of a man who has carried weather on his back across 3 provinces and 2 debates. He lays out 2 families of tables. The familiar lineage you've grown up with from the Ming transmissions that keep your lodges and months walking in step, and a leaner, foreign-looking set compiled by men who describe the heavens with the cool grammar of gears. You sharpen your brush, warm your fingers at the chimney, and start translating strangers into colleagues. The first bundle belongs to continuity. A Cheonsang branch in a hand you recognize, sky positions for the 7 planets, seasonal corrections, and moon tables you could copy asleep. Mainstream historical fact. Joseon astronomers had long worked with Chinese, derived computational methods, and homegrown refinements, the 7 luminaries calculations that placed sun, moon, and planets where the almanac promised, so that rituals, agriculture, and drums stayed punctual. The margins here are crowded with household wisdom. Good when fog, subtract if frost. You nod, because your rice grains and pinhole card are distant cousins of those notes. The second bundle wears a different face. Characters march in crisp, spare columns, and in the interstices lurk tiny western marks that look like ladders and anchors, signs for fractions and angles that prefer circles to abacuses. Jesuit ephemerides, the senior says softly. Late. Ming work that drifted into Qing palaces and out again by envoy, rumor, and curiosity. All under the umbrella of a calendar reform that replaced an older system with the new method. Mainstream historical fact. In the 17th century, Jesuit missionaries at the Ming and early Qing court names, like Shaw and Verbiest, helped craft the Shixian calendar, a reform that married observations, European instruments, and spherical trigonometry to imperial timekeeping. Their tables and instruments traveled East Asian roads in copies, summaries, and arguments. You write, new method tables consulted in a hand that remembers both the brass ring and the stone map. You do what you always do when faced with loud novelty. You line it up against the roof. You pick a planet Venus as being overly helpful near dawn this season and compare 3 ways: your familiar table, the Jesuit sheet, and the Armillery's gentle truth. The ennui gives you an angle that smells of oil and patience. The tables disagree by small, persuasive numbers. The new method closer by a hair you can almost feel. If 3 hairs point the same way for a month, the senior says, we trim our pride. You mark a dot beside the closer column and add, check again after T, because T improves even accurate numbers. The Jesuit sheet suggests a different way to breathe. It wants your sky in a single spherical room, not as lanes braided from habit. Its corrections speak in signs and tangents that taste like iron to your tongue. You whisper the lodge names to soften them: horn and room, well and willow, so your hand doesn't seize up. Historians still argue whether Joseon court adoption of the reformed Chinese calendar, based on Jesuit techniques, happened briskly or in a polite, multi-year shuffle of trial runs, provincial hesitations, and palace debates. The surviving edicts and almanac prefaces can be read as both decisive and gradual, depending on whose comma you trust. You copy with both speeds at once, careful and curious. Quirky tidbit from the envoy who brought one booklet, a man with a sailor's calf muscles and a scholar's calluses. In Beijing, he saw a world map with oceans drawn like folded silk and a meridian daring to run right through foreign capitals. He swears the Jesuits produced tiny lenses that made moon craters look like dried bean curd. You have no way to check bean curd against the ecliptic, but the image sits in your ledger like a polite guest, and your lamp minder instantly asks whether such lenses might also improve wick trimming. You promise nothing and draw a discreet little circle in the margin labeled Moonbeam Rumor. To keep the 2 families of sky from quarreling on your page, you build a corridor between them. You write the familiar lodge first, moon in room toward heart, then append a small parenthetical from the Jesuit sheet, an angle measured in degrees that caresses your memory of the brass. Where your own tables drift a little late on a planet, you tuck the foreign correction beside it, not as a revolution but as a neighbor offering salt. Light joke number 1. If the steward asks whether you have converted, you will say you have set up a shared pantry. You try a small, practical miracle. The new tables predict a comet's place by a formula that seems too satisfied with itself. Last watch's thin tail, the broom that kept its manners, should lean nearer to a particular lodge. You check, framing the tail with the ash-dusted thread and the bowl trick, and it agrees with the Jesuit whisper enough to make you feel you've met a cousin you didn't know you had. You draw a neat triangle, tail, lodge, prediction, and label it with both vocabularies, so your future self won't forget how the 2 dialects shook hands. Light joke number 2. You promise to stop calling it a broom if it insists on knowing trigonometry. The senior urges a deeper courtesy. Understand the machine, he says, tapping the Jesuit preface where Latin ghosts through Chinese characters. You read the method aloud in the softest voice, as if you were trying not to wake a child's solar anomalies, lunar inequalities, the geometry of circles that refuse to be round on paper. Then you set the ennui to echo the logic tilting the ecliptic ring, checking the pole, walking the declination scale with a finger that thinks in both lodges and longitudes. Your ledger receives a braid, lodge, tail, degree. So many. Instrument? Agreeable. Historians still argue whether this bilingual habit ever spread widely in the bureau or stayed with a handful of tinkerers and curious officials. A few surviving sheets wear double notations like yours, and many more behave as if the stone map alone were in the room. You take the question where you take all questions that threaten to become devotions. The roof. You line Polaris, greet the dipper, and read Venus's haughty lamp again. The new table's number kisses the tube's mark with that tiny satisfaction you have when a wick flame finally agrees to whisper. You do not dance. You add 1 grain of sand to the stew of ink, grind 3 circles, and write, New ephemeris agrees. Adopt provisionally. Sky's obedient. Light joke number 3. You consider adding apprentice obedient and decide to keep that promise between you and the doll. There is also the matter of names. The Jesuit sheet carries other names inside its bones, Latin behind Chinese, a habit of baptizing points with a catalog number instead of a ferry or a gate. You refuse to trade Eve pins for star 123. Not because numbers are rude, but because tired guards prefer hooks to codes. So you keep the household nicknames and let the calculations wear a second jacket in the margins. When I say rake star, you tell your page, I mean this angle here. The page, being a page, approves of footnotes that make everyone's job easier. With dawn still far enough away to be merciful, you try a calendar line, because calendars are where math either becomes bread or becomes a sermon. Tomorrow's ritual hour, as set by your familiar tables, lands a sliver later than the new method's suggestion. You reconcile them before any minister has to. Right begins at the old stroke. Timekeepers adopt new drift quietly thereafter. Your phrase tastes like porridge with 2 kinds of rice, a little richer, still gentle. Mainstream historical fact, folded in as if it were your own thought. Every court that adopted the new calendar negotiated pride, precedent, and practice. Official edicts often wore calm faces while workshops and rooftops did the real smoothing. All night the debate sits at your elbow like a polite cat. Does adopting a sharper instrument mean changing the music, or only tuning the strings? Historians still argue whether these adoptions reshaped Josian nightwork profoundly or simply cleaned its edges. Your hands suggest that the sky feels the same no matter which arithmetic brings breakfast on time. The dipper still leans, the pole still sits. Your barley, pale companion, still keeps an appointment because you keep yours. At last you copy a compromise onto the morning board, in a sentence that would make both the stone carver and the brass filer nod. Observations confirm positions by instrument and table. New method consulted. Names and lodges unchanged. Calendars steady. You set the ash, thread, and the pinhole card on top of the Jesuit booklet as if tucking a blanket over a guest. You take 1 last reading for Venus, then 1 sip of tea for your nerves. Your lamp chimney wears its narrow halo like a promise you intend to keep. Adopt what helps, keep what orients, report without panic. And remember, rice is counted in bowls, not in equations. And when the doll taps a clean bell in the room below, you add 1 more quiet line to the ledger Bridges held, and feel the sky nod in 2 languages at once. You lift the drying frame and take down last watch's sheets. The paper cool as pond shade and stippled with the tiny sand you shook like friendly snow. The senior says, it is time to make a catalog, nothing grand, just a sample of the names that behave. The ones colleagues whisper at the frame without embarrassment. You do not spread a map or raise a ring. You spread your sleeve and read. You begin, as the roof has taught you, where patience holds court. Buxiong, the North Star. Pole seated, breath steady. Empire's chair unshaken. First, second, third guards of the dipper. Attentive. Hour keepers. No quarrel with haze. Bowl stars. 4 information. Bowl level. Barley. Pale companion north of 4th. Uncomplaining. Mainstream historical fact steadies your pen. Court star catalogs in Josian follow the inherited Chinese lattice, the 3 great enclosures, and the 28 lunar lodges, so that each asterism has an address and purpose, more household register than conquest. Under that order, your nicknames become polite servants, not little revolutions. You let the catalog wander into your own neighborhood, where the stone's market lanes and roof carpenters lend you their nouns. Market North Milestone, within the heavenly market enclosure. Faint, helpful, points to clerkly patience. Ferry, outer enclosure. Paired lights by the eaves, returning late, obedient. Gate lanterns, near wall. 2 modest flames. Guards approve. Eve pins. Bracket markers within wall. Alignments more polite after shim. You pause, enjoying the way polite has become a unit of measure. Light joke number 1. If you could invoice by politeness, the armillary would fund everyone's tea. Your brush drifts riverward because the roof likes to remember water even when it is dry. Riverbend trio. Low and patient. Fishermen call for anchoring stories. Netmender. Triangle tucked by key. Men's morale when wind sulks. Gull's ladder. 4 steps to steer between shoals, do not show off. Saltwife. Lamp, clinging pair near south wall, for late return reassurance. You add the border guard's gift because a good phrase likes a fence to lean on. Watch prongs by the palisade notch. Thread angle and pole agree. Twice when 3 makes a door. The 3 lodge nods from winter's shoulder Orion made house, friendly. 3's shoulder. Lantern of courage. Gate locked twice, then kindness. Your catalog walks the 28 lodges without pretending to recite a hymn. Horn. Seedbed sign. Start small. Neck. Cord and harness. Tighten gently. Root. Transplanting permission. Tempers obedient. Room. Bedding aired. Moon crosses with manners. Heart. The red coal in Scorpius. Heat speaks. Thunder rehearses. Tail and basket. Sweep. Collect. Breathe. You grin at your own margins, kitchen words, hiding inside astronomy, and the ledger grins back by not smudging. You move north again because the pole keeps making a magnet of your sentences. Ox and girl. Honest chores, shelf counted twice. Emptiness, rooftop, wall. Architecture for repairs, mortar checked. Eve drip notable. Light joke number 2 asks to be let in. You briefly propose supervisor's eyebrow for a prickly pear by the dipper, and retire it immediately to the reed basket labeled Too Proud. The basket lives under the desk. It creaks like a moral. You fold in the festivals without letting them turn the page into a ballad. The numbers stay. The story stands beside them with its hat off. Weaver, Vega, and cowherd, Altair. Appointment kept, river bright, Chilziok water plentiful. Winter noon shadow, by sundial. Longest on Dongji, Pachik observed. No omens inferred. A line for the instruments sneaks into the catalog because names that forget brass grow wobbly. Hanui echo. Angles for Eve pins and fairy agree. Coin shim earns another thanks. Doll's hour. Bell polite, commas safer. You add the temporary citizens, the visitors that knock softly and refuse to sign the guest book with their own names. Guest star within net. Small, steady, barley tone. Winds obedient. Broom star. Thin tail toward room. Angle checked by ash, thread, and water bowl. Modest. Quirky tidbit gets a dignified line. Because rumor that proves useful deserves a chair. Wick salt. One whisper rubbed into crown, smoke less mischievous. Steward none the wiser. You scatter the quiet household lore that kept you awake without scolding. Pinhole card. Small, smaller humility. Faint points confess. Rice grain council. Draft detector. Morale bead. Roasted barley. Chewed for adjectives. Tea corrective. Historians still argue whether such vernacular notes ever sat in an official glossary, an internal little names register, or whether they remained oral, traveling by sleeve and wink. A few marginal pencils in surviving sheets suggest both a conspiracy and a courtesy. You tilt back into the enclosures because the stone downstairs has been patient with your stories and wants its proper bow. Purple forbidden enclosure. Walled stillness. Sovereign furniture. Do not decorate. Supreme Palace enclosure. Garden of measured paths. Shadows agree with duty. Heavenly market enclosure. Stalls of dots, bargaining of light. Roads promised. Beneath those, the tiny oddities that slipped into the ledger when no one was watching, and everyone approved by pretending not to notice. Cricket stove. 3. Dot warmth near kitchens. Night attendants, smile. Sash tie. Kink that aligns a street when fog plays games. Roof brackets. Retitled from Eve pins twice. Carpenters voted yes both times. You let one unhelpful relic peek out so the steward can be pleased at its absence. Stubborn speck. Scrubbed by sunrise. Apology signed with hot water. Light joke number 3. You consider porridge star. For a faint pear you noticed over a cookhouse, and hear the senior's resignation letter write itself. You rename it Steam Window, and everyone survives the morning board. A page enters with your favorite smell in winter paper that has not yet decided whether to curl. He lays a slip for cross-checking. Rake-star by girl's sleeve, confirm phrasing. You put it into the catalog as if it had always belonged. Rake-star by girl's sleeve. Domestic, directional. Tongue says yes. Brass agrees. Your brush, warmed by repetition, remembers its circles on the inkstone. You add small breathe marks, the neat dots a former steward invented to mean checked twice. Quirky tidbit wraps back through the room. Someone scents the drying sand with a peel of tangerine in winter to persuade silverfish to choose another office and to persuade apprentices to think of New Year instead of mildew. The sand, being sand, is effective at both jobs. You close the sample with the sentences that keep the bureau from mistaking a catalog for a confession. Corrections. Pole offset negligible for tonight's duty. Procession noted, no panic. Calendar. Rites unaltered. Farmers informed by horn and well. Lodges walked. Weather. Haze and curls. Lamp smoke obedient. Eyes refreshed. Then you read the list out loud in the cadence you use for the water clock strip. Each line a bead. Each bead a step a colleague can take with a sleepy brain and a clear duty. You do not pretend this is every star, or even the best of them. You pretend, correctly, that it is enough to keep the king's tea on time, the harbor honest, the border awake, and the city's mattresses turned under a sky that refuses to be impressed and nevertheless approves of careful people. Historians still argue whether a night like this calm catalogue, few guests, obedient winds was typical, or merely the kind that leaves better paper behind, the senior says, and his eyebrows attempt a smile. The argument is welcome. It means the work happened long enough to be compared. You pin the sample to the morning board with a strip of reed, the ink already dulled to the color of sleep. You underline nothing. You circle nothing. You give barley pale companion a final dot of affection and resist the temptation to tuck a rice grain beside it as punctuation. The doll below taps. A watch turns. The armillary's rings pretend to be still. The stone remembers you without effort. You breathe in for 7, out for 8, and the catalog becomes what catalogs are supposed to be. A room where names wait quietly for someone to need them, and then walk off the page with their shoes already tied. You feel it before you see it, the night loosening its belt, the ledger pages cooling, the lamp consenting to a smaller breath. Last watch is a soft hallway. You walk it with care. The dipper's handle has leaned far enough to tell even the laziest rooster what time the porridge will begin to think about being kind. Below you, the water clock's doll raises its mallet with the dignity of someone who has done this every night since brass learned manners. Mainstream historical fact. The Joseon night is divided into 5 watches, gyeong, each struck by the palace clock. Just before dawn, city bells such as Bosingak signal the soon opening of the gates, turning sky-keeping into street-keeping. You write the hour as if your brush were a gate pin sliding home, no flourish, only fit. There's one job left, the sort that makes apprentices believe in quiet luck even when they swear they don't. Coin a last modest name before the light steals your stars. You lean into the wooden frame and let the east clarify by degrees. Low above the eaves inside the same lanes you've walked all week, you find 2 faint points bracketing a third that tonight insists on being useful. They sit exactly where your colleagues complain about misplacing the first ladder of the day. They make a neat notch with the roofline. Your mouth tests 3 candidates and rejects 2 for vanity. Then the phrase that behaves arrives and waits like a good guest. Dawn hinge. You check it the way you have been taught. Brass first, a quick transit on the ennui. Declination whispering something that agrees with your ribs. Stone second. A glance at the Cheonsang Yeolcha Bunyajido's boundary lines to be sure you are not naming outside your lane. Roof third. You set your ash-dusted thread across the frame to confirm the tiny angle between the outer pair and the middle light, because tidy hinges swing true. Dawn hinge. You copy into the ledger with its coordinates, its lodge note, and its temperament, unpretending. Light joke number 1. You resist the impulse to submit a requisition for hinges for every committee door in the palace. You add the companion lines because names travel better with provisions. Useful for orienting ledgers at first light. Agreeable with reeve pins when haze sulks. Kind to sleepy guards. The senior reads over your shoulder, eyebrows lowering into something almost like affection. It will help, he says, which in this bureau is indistinguishable from applause. Historians still argue whether Don nicknames like these household aids that never received a formal asterism entry were tolerated officially or only tolerated unofficially, so long as they proved themselves in 3 winters. You underline nothing, circle nothing, and trust the hinge to find adopters by doing its job. You tidy. The lamp wick trimmed, the chimney wiped with a square of mulberry that has outlived 2 supervisors. The rice grains collected and returned to the little paper twist, with a bow neither they nor you require. Brushes, rinsed at the inkstone's mouth, twirled to a point, laid on the rest, small, smaller, humility. Inkstone, a fingertip of water to persuade the pool to sleep. Ledger, powder snowed across the last strokes, pages lifted to the drying frame where bamboo slats hold the night, the way careful fingers hold a bird. You return the brass shim to your pocket, not lucky, honest because it has become your way to remember that straightness can be rehearsed. Quirky tidbit floats up from the lamp minder as he stows his tools. On last watch, some scribes tie a thread of red silk around the brush ferrule not for omens, he insists, but so it's easy to find if you set it down on dark paper. Of course, the thread keeps being forgotten on daylight brushes. And of course, the steward pretends not to see. You eye a bright thread and decide that if Dawn Hinge survives a month, you'll give it a ribbon in your mind and nowhere else. You walk the roof once more. A small procession of you, your lamp, and 3 names that now feel like furniture. Gate lanterns, Eve pins, Dawn Hinge. You mention the barley pail companion north of the Dipper's Fourth for the last time tonight, mostly as a thank you. You step to the parapet and check your rice, 2 grains roll a polite hair and stop, bowing out. Light joke number 2. The moths hold a union meeting at the far lantern and pass a resolution against your chimney's new humility. You promise to submit their demands to the wick. The city stirs under your sentences. Somewhere a cook lifts a lid to let steam say hello to air. Somewhere, a courier counts the last sand in his glass and decides which gate to sprint for when Bozengak begins its throat clearing. Somewhere, a scholar dreams an argument about whether untroubled is a better adjective than obedient and wakes believing he has invented both. You add your last line to the morning board. Dawn Hinge coined. Coordinates attached. Adopt provisionally. Rights unchanged. Winds courteous. You visit the stone room to thank the slab. Palm on bunya like a promise. The grooves are cool as river shade. The characters look like an early frost that refuses dramatics. You lock the canopy with the key that never hurries. In the clock pavilion, you nod to the doll, which nods back with a sound that feels like a warm towel on a winter wrist. Mainstream note to make the archivists happy. The Sungjeongwon scribes will pull your slip soon. And today's dry prose, the guest star still barley, the broom star still thin, the hinge named without boasting, will travel toward the annals, where kings and kitchens share paper without arguing about who belongs there. You allow yourself 3 housekeeping grins. First, the wick takes its trimming like a model citizen. Second, the pinhole card goes back into the drawer with the ash thread and the lucky fish scale that definitely isn't lucky. Third, the carp and sleepy tiger paperweights guard the last 2 drying sheets like loyal pets who know the route from night to morning. Light joke number 3. You salute both animals and promote them to the rank of assistant comma. There is always one doubt that wants a final rehearsal at this hour, and you give it a gentle stage. Historians still argue whether kings actually read last, watch sheets before breakfast, or preferred summaries shaped by stewards with very neat hair. You solve nothing. You only seal your envelope with a breath and place it on the tray where neat hair and bright eyes will do what they always do. Translate sky into schedule and schedule into soup. East brightens. The hinge of your name finds literal company in the color of the roof tiles. You blow the lamp so low it purrs like a cat refusing to move from a good lap. You gather the ledger and feel the night slide off your shoulders the way a cloak remembers the hook. You breathe in for 7, out for 8, and carry your small parliament of tools toward the stair. Behind you, the roof keeps its sentences, the pole sits with its unending chair, and the last tiny points that earned your hinge fade like polite servants stepping backward through a door they have just closed. Word count: 1094. Wind down to 300 words. Let the pages lie flat and cool. Let the ink finish its slow, dark settling, the way dew settles on tile and fence and the quiet backs of sleeping oxen. You can feel the night easing itself into a softer shape, edges rounded, hinges smoothed, every tool returned to its pocket, every pocket calm against your side. The clock downstairs continues without you, smaller now, more like rain on a distant porch roof than work. The doll lifts and lowers its arm, not to call anyone, only to keep company with the last few breaths before light. You allow the sky to blur into one tender room, no lodges, no enclosures, no lines to mind, just a pale band widening behind the eaves. The names you kept so carefully grow comfortable and quiet. Gate lanterns dim to memory, eave pins become ordinary wood and shadow, dawn hinge warms until it belongs to the color of morning. Your shoulders find a lower place to sit. Your jaw forgets its duties. Even your clever little tricks, the pinhole card, the ash thread, the rice grains fall asleep in their drawer, as if they understand that nothing urgent remains. Breathe in a long, soft way, and imagine that breath traveling along the same routes you walked. Up the stair to the roof, across the wooden frame, down to the stone map's cool grooves, over to the brass rings that still smell faintly of cloth and oil, and back again to this simple, comfortable chair. The city below is untying its knots in slow motion, gates unbarred, kettles humming, sandals finding straps, and none of it requires effort from you now. The sky has been minded. The board is written. The morning can roll forward on its own careful wheels. If your eyes close, they close like doors that have learned good hinges, quietly, evenly, without haste. If they stay half open, they rest the way a lamp rests, with a very small flame, enough to be friendly, not enough to wake the moths. Let the last of the night dilate into a soft blur. Let the first of the day arrive only as a kindness. Nothing asks, everything allows. Sleep is just the sky renaming you untroubled for a while.